Orson Vane's thick fingers wrapped around the dying hen's neck like he was testing the weight of something already worthless. He didn't even look at the bird. He looked at Mira. "Take them," he said loud enough for the whole market to hear. "All 46 of them. Let the fat woman haul home her death flock." The laughter hit before the words finished landing. And Mira Bellamy, 28 years old, alone, behind on every debt she owned, stood there in the dirt and the heat and didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just started loading chickens onto her cart, one by one, while the whole town of Cinder Hollow watched and laughed, and assumed they already knew how her story would end. They were wrong. Before we go any further, if you've ever been the person everyone counted out, if you've ever had someone laugh at you like your dreams were the punchline, stay with me. That subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell on this channel are for people who know what it feels like to be underestimated. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far Mira's story travels. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next in Cinder Hollow will make you question everything you thought you knew about strength. The summer of that year came early and stayed mean. By the last week of May, the wells in Cinder Hollow were already pulling up mud at the bottom of their buckets. The creek that usually ran quick and cold through the eastern edge of town had dropped to a slow brown trickle. Old teamers stood on their porches in the evening and looked at the sky the way you look at someone who owes you money and keeps not showing up, with dread and a little anger and nowhere near enough hope. Mira Bellamy felt all of that. She felt it in her knees when she climbed out of bed. She felt it in the dry air that hit her face when she opened the farmhouse door before sunrise. She felt it in the creak of the pump handle that gave her less water each morning than the morning before. Her 5 acres sat on a stretch of land the locals called scorchback ground, and they didn't mean it kindly. The soil was pale and stubborn. The grass grew in patches and quit early. 2 previous owners had walked away from the property inside of 3 years each, and before Mira had bought it with her savings and her dead mother's small bequest, most people in town assumed the land would just sit empty until the territory reclaimed it entirely. She had not walked away, not in 2 years of trying, but she was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. That particular kind of tired that settles into a person's chest and lives there, quiet and heavy, when the gap between what you hoped for and what you've got stays wide for too long. She was also alone, had been since her mother died, had been in the way that really counts for most of her life. Mira was a large woman, tall, heavy, broad across the shoulders, in a way that some people took for slowness, for laziness, for something that needed to be explained or apologized for. In a town like Cinder Hollow, where a woman's worth was measured in how quickly she could disappear into the background and how little she asked for, Mira stood out in every wrong way. She was too big, too quiet, too stubborn, too alone on that useless strip of pale ground. She had heard every version of what people thought about her. Some said it to her face. Most said it just loud enough for her to hear as she passed. She had stopped expecting anything different from most of them. But she still had to eat. She still had debts. She still had 5 acres of cracked earth that refused to cooperate, and a farmhouse that needed a new roof section she couldn't afford yet, and a well that was shrinking by the week. So on that last Saturday of May, she hitched her old gray horse to the cart before dawn and drove the 4 miles into town for the market. The Cinder Hollow market happened every Saturday in the wide dirt square behind the grain exchange. Farmers and ranchers laid out what they had: produce, livestock, tools, preserved goods, and tried to trade or sell before the heat of the afternoon made everyone miserable and short-tempered. Mira arrived later than she'd planned. One of the cartwheels had caught a rut on the hardpack road, and she'd had to stop and check it, wasting 20 minutes she didn't have. By the time she got there, the square was already full, and the noise hit her immediately, the low, steady buzz of negotiation and complaint that sounded the same at every market in every hard summer she could remember. She was there to buy seed. Specifically, she needed a small amount of drought-resistant sorghum that Tilda Moravec, her closest neighbor, had told if its windows were dark, had told her about a variety that a trader sometimes brought down from the North Country and sold quietly at the back of the market without making a big show of it. Tilda had given her a description of the man and told her to get there early, because the seed always moved fast. She hadn't gotten there early. She was threading through the crowd, trying to find the northern trader, when she heard the commotion near the eastern end of the square. Not an argument, exactly. More like an audience gathering. The kind of cluster that forms when something is happening that people find amusing or interesting or useful to witness. Mira didn't intend to stop. She had business to do and not much time before the heat made the walk back to her cart unpleasant. But something about the pitch of the laughter, and it was laughter, sharp and mean around the edges, made her slow down. She found a gap between two women with market baskets and looked through. Harlan Pike stood in the center of a rough circle of onlookers, and around him on the ground were crates. Wooden crates stacked in a rough cluster, and inside them, pressing against the slats, were chickens. 40, maybe more. They weren't moving much. Their heads drooped. Some sat against the crate walls in that loose, defeated way that animals go when they've stopped fighting whatever is happening to them. Harlan was a rancher mid-50s, weathered, the kind of man who had been successful enough for long enough that failure had started to look like someone else's problem. He raised cattle, kept horses, and had always kept chickens as something between a hobby and a practical afterthought. He was not a cruel man, Mira thought, though she didn't know him well. But he was a practical one, and right now his face had the look of a man doing an unpleasant calculation. Heat got into them. He was saying to the men nearest him. 3 weeks ago, they started dropping off. Stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped laying. I've put more feed into them than they'll ever produce back out, and I need the space, and I need the money. Rather do it clean than drag it out. Do it clean meant kill them. Mira understood that without him having to say it directly. She looked at the birds again. The crates were stacked in direct sunlight. That was the first thing she noticed. Not shade-full sun on the hottest part of the morning, with 40-something already heat-stressed birds packed into wooden boxes. The second thing she noticed was their legs. She had to look twice to be sure. The legs of most chickens she'd seen were the usual pale yellow or sometimes gray-white. These birds had legs that ran darker a blue-gray, almost like old slate. Unusual. She'd seen a drawing once, and a farming almanac Tilda had lent her, of a heritage breed with that coloring. A breed noted for something she was trying to remember. She was still trying to remember it when the voice came from behind, and to her left, loud and self-satisfied and instantly recognizable. 46 dying chickens and no takers. Orson Vane said it the way a man says something he already knows the answer to. He was standing at the edge of the crowd with two of the men, who always seemed to be near him, not quite employees, not friends, quite friends, just people who found it useful to be in his proximity. Most of its windows were dark. Vane owned the largest grain supply in the county, held debts from half the farmers in the territory, and had a way of filling a space that made other people feel like they were standing in it by his permission. He was looking at the crates. Then he looked up, and his gaze moved through the crowd and landed on Mira, and she saw the moment he decided to use her. Unless Vane said, louder now, someone with more optimism than sense wants to take them off Harlan's hands. He was smiling. It was a smile that already contained the punchline. Mira felt the attention shift toward her before she'd said a single word. That was if its windows were dark. That was the thing about being the largest woman at a small-town market. People always seemed to know where she was, even when she'd rather they didn't. She should have walked away. She knew that. The sensible thing, the self-protective thing, was to let Harlan deal with his birds and find her sorghum seed and go home. But she was still thinking about those slate-blue legs. And she was thinking about the deep ravine that cut across the northeast corner of her property, the one that held shade and moisture, even in July, the one that 2 previous owners had called useless, because it made that section of land hard to plow. She'd never tried to plow it. She'd looked at it and thought, shade. She'd thought, protected. She hadn't known what to protect yet. I'll take them, she said. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the laughter started, and it didn't come from one direction. It came from everywhere at once, so sound when a crowd finds something unanimously funny and doesn't bother to be polite about it. Harlan stared at her. He wasn't laughing. He looked more like a man trying to figure out if this was a genuine offer or some kind of social performance he didn't understand. All 46, Mira said. Her voice was level. She had learned a long time ago that the surest way to give people more to laugh at was to let them see that they'd reached you. I'll take all of them. What do you want for them? Nothing, Harlan said slowly. I'm not selling them. I'm getting rid of them. They're not worth money, lady. Then I'll take them for free. More laughter. Someone behind her said something she chose not to catch. Orson Vane stepped a little closer, not aggressively, just enough to make it clear. He was part of this now, and intended to stay part of it. The fat woman wants your dying chickens, Harlan. He was enjoying himself in the particular way of a man who rarely experiences real opposition. I'd let her have them. Save you the trouble of the dispatch. Mira did not look at Vane. She kept her eyes on Harlan. Harlan looked at the birds. He looked at Mira. He was doing that practical calculation. Again, she could see it in his face, weighing the strangeness of the situation against the genuine problem of having 46 useless birds taking up space and feed. You can get them to your property? He asked. I've got a cart. They might all be dead by tonight, he said. And it wasn't cruel, it was just the truth as he understood it, offered plainly. They might, Mira agreed. That's my risk to take. Another long pause. Vane was saying something to the men beside him, and she could hear laughter from that direction. But she kept her attention on Harlan. All right, Harlan said finally, with the tone of a man closing a chapter he's ready to be done with. They're yours. You need help loading them? I'll manage. She wasn't entirely sure that was true when she said it. The crates were heavy, and the cart was at the other end of the square, and she was already tired from the drive in. But she said it anyway. Loading 46 heat-struck chickens in wooden crates onto a farm cart in front of a crowd of people who are waiting for you to fail is a specific kind of experience that Mira would think about for a long time afterward. Not because it was the hardest thing she'd ever done. It wasn't. But because of the way the watching felt the weight of it pressing against the back of her neck, like something physical. Every time she had to stop to rest her arms, every time she adjusted her grip and had to set a crate down. For a moment, she felt the attention sharpen. She heard the comments that people made to each other, not quite quiet enough to be private. She loaded every crate. It took her the better part of an hour. At some point, a 10-year-old boy appeared beside her and picked up one end of a crate without asking. She looked at him. He had a thin, serious face and mud on both knees, and the expression of someone who had decided to do something and wasn't going to explain himself about it. Owens, Rusk, he said when she kept looking at him. You live here in town? My grandmother does. She sends me to market on Saturdays. Does she know where you are right now? He considered this with more seriousness than most adults would have given to the question. She knows I'm at the market, he said finally. Mira decided that was close enough to a yes for present purposes. Other end of that crate, she said, and they lifted it together. He helped her load the last 9 crates. He didn't talk much, which she appreciated. When they'd secured the final one, he stood there looking at the cart with its cargo of sagging, listless birds, and he said, without particular judgment, "Do you think they're going to live?" "I don't know," Mira said honestly. "Why are you taking them if you don't know?" She looked at the birds, at those pale slate legs, at the one hen nearest her who was watching her with one eye in the particular focused way of an animal that is tired but not yet finished. "Because I think they might," she said, "and that's enough reason." Owens Rusk thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded, the way a child nods when an adult says something that actually makes sense to them instead of something that adults just say. Orson Vane was still at the edge of the square when she climbed up to the cart bench. She felt him watching. She did not look at him. She picked up the reins, and the gray horse started forward, and the cart with 46 maybe dying chickens creaked out of the market square and onto the road towards scorchback ground. Tilda Moravec was 73 years old and had survived 2 husbands, a prairie fire, a cholera season, and 4 decades of Wyoming Territory weather with the particular calm of a woman who has stopped surprised by difficulty. She lived on 12 acres directly west of Mira's property, and she had been Mira's nearest neighbor and irregular teacher since the first week Mira had arrived. Tilda had forgotten more about farming than most people in Cinder Hollow would ever know. She kept that knowledge like other people, kept money not advertised, offered only when the need was real. Mira arrived at Tilda's door that afternoon, still dusty from the road, and she described what she'd found at the market. The birds, their condition, the slate-blue legs, the way they'd gone off food and water. Tilda went very still in the particular way she had when something was interesting to her. Slate-colored legs, she said. And the combs, what color were the combs? Mira tried to remember. red but pale, not bright. And the build of them? Blocky or lean, long-backed. Tilda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Those sound like they might be old-blood heritage birds. Kind my grandmother kept. People stopped raising them because they don't fatten up the same way the common breeds do, and buyers wanted weight. But they were known for something else." She paused. They were known for not quitting in heat that killed everything else. Mira felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, she was careful with hope. Something more like the recognition of possibility. "What do I do for them right now?" she asked. Tilda told her. She talked for 40 minutes, and Mira listened away. She listened to everything that mattered completely, without interruption, filing it all away. Cool water in shallow containers, not deep buckets exhausted birds, sometimes drown themselves trying to drink. Shade immediately, and not just any shade, the deep, still shade that doesn't shift. Electrolytes if she had them, and Tilda said she had a small supply she'd give her. Soft food, not hard-grain crushed corn soaked in water to start. No stress, no noise, no handling unless absolutely necessary. "And watch them," Tilda said. "Watch each one. The ones that lift their heads on their own are the ones to build your hope around." Mira got the birds into the ravine before the last of the afternoon heat peaked. The ravine that cut across the northeast corner of her property was maybe 15 feet deep at its lowest point and ran roughly 40 yards along the eastern boundary. Though most of its windows were clay and rock, and old oak roots came through them in places, and at the bottom there was still enough moisture in the soil to feel different from everything above. In summer it held shade from mid-morning until late afternoon, the kind of deep, still shade that had its own temperature, noticeably cooler than the open ground above. 2 previous owners had called it useless. You couldn't plow it. You couldn't run cattle through it easily. It was just a scar in the land that complicated everything around it. Mira had looked at it from her first week and thought, refuge. She had never known from what until today. She lowered the crates into the ravine one by one, which was harder than loading them had been. She rigged a rope system to the old oak that grew at the edge, looping it around the trunk, using it as a brake, and she lowered each crate hand over hand, her shoulders burning, stopping twice to rest them before she could continue. When all 46 birds were down in the shade, she climbed down herself and began the work Tilda had described. The shallow water containers, the soaked crushed corn. She didn't have the electrolytes yet. She'd need to go back to Tilda's for those in the morning. But she did what she could with what she had, moving slowly through the ravine, placing containers, watching each bird. Most of them ignored her. A few shifted away when she got close. That movement was actually good. It meant they had enough in them to respond. One hen watched her with that same focused single-eye attention that the bird in the crate had shown at the market. This one was slightly larger than the others, with a damaged left toe that had healed crooked at some point. She didn't move away when Mira approached. She just watched still and measuring. Mira crouched in front of her and held out a small handful of the wet corn. The hen looked at it, looked at Mira, looked at the corn again. Then she ate it, slowly, deliberately, like someone deciding to trust a situation they were still not entirely sure about. Mira stayed crouched there a long time after the corn was gone, watching the hen and the hen watching her back. Her legs ached from the position. The ravine walls were damp and cool, and the light was going golden above the oak leaves at the top. She thought about Vane's face when she'd said she'd take the birds. She thought about the laughter. She thought, all right, let them laugh. She thought, let's see how this goes. That night, she sat at her kitchen table and looked at what she had on paper. Debts more than she liked. The feed store account was due in 6 weeks. The property tax assessment was coming in September. She had enough money to manage through July if nothing broke, and she was already owed repairs on the well casing and the east wall of the chicken run she'd never managed to build. She added 46 additional mouths to the list. Feed required, the water, the work hours. The numbers were not encouraging. She sat there for a while, not moving, just looking at what she'd written, the way you sometimes have to look at a bad hand of cards and just accept that this is what you're playing. Then she turned the paper over and started writing something else. What she'd need, what she had, what she could do without money if she used the ravine correctly, what she could potentially produce if even half the birds recovered and proved to be what Tilda thought they might be. She wrote slowly. She crossed things out and wrote them again. By the time the candle had burned down a third of its length, the numbers on the second side of the paper didn't look like a disaster anymore. They looked like a very steep climb. She had climbed steep things before. She folded the paper and put it in the tin box where she kept important documents, and she went to bed. In the ravine below the east oak, 46 birds settled in the dark and the cool, and at least some of them were still breathing. And on the edge of that pale, stubborn 5 acres that everyone had written off, something was beginning quietly, without permission, without any fanfare at all, to take root. The first morning after, Mira woke before the sun. She didn't set an alarm, she didn't own one. She just woke up, the way she'd been waking up early her entire adult life, with that immediate sense of something waiting that needed to be dealt with. For most of her life, that feeling had been dread. This morning, it was something different. Not quite hope. More like the particular anxiety of a person who has made a bet they're not sure about and now has to go see how the odds held overnight. She pulled on her boots and her work coat and walked out into the dark. The air was still cool, that brief window before sunrise when Wyoming remembered it was capable of mercy. Stars were thick and low. The gray horse shifted in the paddock when he heard her footsteps and then settled again when she didn't go toward him. She went to the ravine. She lay flat on the edge and looked down into the dark below the oak, and she listened. Movement. She could hear it. The soft rustle of birds adjusting, the low murmuring sounds that chickens make when they're awake and calm and bothering each other slightly. Not the heavy, unresponsive stillness of yesterday afternoon, when she'd first gotten them settled. They were moving. She exhaled and sat up and put her hands on her knees and stayed there for a while, looking at nothing in particular, while the sky went from black to deep blue to the pale gray of early morning. Several were dead. She found 3 when she climbed down with her lantern, 2 near the north wall, 1 in the corner where the crate seam had left a gap. She was not surprised. She had prepared herself for worse. She pulled them out carefully and set them aside and checked the others, moving slowly through the ravine the way Tilda had told her, no sudden gestures, no noise, keeping her body language at the level, so of something that simply existed in the space rather than threatened it. The hen with the crooked toe was standing. Not eating yet, not drinking, just standing, but upright, with her head at a normal angle, watching Mira come toward her with that same assessing attention as the night before. "Still here," Mira said quietly. The hen blinked. "That's something," Mira said, and refilled the water container nearest to her. She was back at Tilda's door by full sunrise, which Tilda apparently found neither surprising nor particularly early, since she already had coffee on and 2 cups set out. How many lost? Before Mira had sat down. 3 overnight. Tilda nodded, not with satisfaction, but with the expression of someone whose estimate had proven accurate. Could have been worse. First night's usually the hardest. If they made it through, most of the rest will pull through if you keep the conditions right. The electrolytes, Mira said, already got them in a jar on the shelf. Take them when you go. Tilda poured the coffee and pushed a cup across the table. Sit down first. You look like you've been up since midnight. Since about 4. Sit down, Tilda said again, with the tone that meant it wasn't a suggestion. Mira sat. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter and exactly what she needed. For a moment they sat in comfortable quiet, which was one of the things Mira valued most about Tilda. She was one of the few people who didn't feel the need to fill silence. "Tilda," Mira said, eventually, "if they are what you think they are, the heritage birds, what does that actually mean for laying? In heat like this?" Tilda wrapped both hands around her cup. "It means they lay when others don't. The common breeds shut down in real heat. Their bodies redirect everything away from production and towards survival. These old blood birds, they develop differently. They were bred in hotter country originally, came north over generations, but the base traits held." She paused. "If it gets as bad as I think it's going to get this summer, and your birds come back to full health, you might be the only person in this county with laying hens by July." The words landed quietly. Mira turned her cup in her hands. "How confident are you?" she asked. Tilda gave her a look that said she was not in the habit of things she wasn't confident about. "Confident enough that I'm telling you to protect that flock, like it's money in a vault, because it might be." Owen Rusk showed up at the gate of Scorchback Ground 2 days later. Most of its windows were dark. Mira was hauling water from the well to the ravine, a trip she was making 6 times a day, which was 6 times more than she'd planned for when she'd structured her daily work, which meant 6 things she'd planned to do weren't getting done. She was tired, and her shoulders had developed a specific ache that started between the blades and spread out both directions by midday, and she was not particularly in the mood for company. Owen stood at the gate and watched her make the walk from the well to the ravine edge and back. He did this for 2 full trips before he said anything. "Why don't you rig a line?" he said. She stopped, set the bucket down, looked at him. "What?" "A line. From the well to the ravine." He squinted at the distance between the 2 points, the way a 10-year-old squints when he's doing math in his head and taking it seriously. "You've got that old pulley on the barn wall. If you ran a rope from the well to the oak tree, you could pull the bucket along instead of carrying it." Mira looked at the distance. She looked at the barn. She looked at the oak. She had carried 46 crates of chickens and hauled water for 3 days and spent 2 nights in the ravine monitoring birds, and she had not once thought of that. "Where does your grandmother think you are?" she asked. "The market," he said. It was Thursday. "The market's on Saturday." "I know." He met her eyes with the expression of a child who has decided that certain details are not the point right now. Mira picked up the bucket. She looked at him for another moment. "Pulleys on a nail on the east barn wall," she said. "There should be enough rope coiled underneath the workbench inside. Don't touch anything else in there." Owen was off the fence and running toward the barn before she finished the sentence. The pulley system he rigged wasn't elegant. It took him 3 hours and 2 different rope configurations, and at one point Mira had to climb the oak tree herself to retie the upper anchor, which was not something her body thanked her for. The first test run dumped water sideways when the bucket hit a slack point in the middle. Owen looked at the spilled water, looked at the rope, and immediately started adjusting the tension. Mira watched him work. He had the particular focus of a kid who finds mechanical problems genuinely interesting rather than frustrating, the kind of focus that doesn't need encouragement or supervision, just space. The second test run worked. The bucket slid along the rope line from the well platform to the ravine edge, losing maybe a quarter of its water to sloshing, which was still significantly less than the spillage from carrying it by hand over uneven ground for 150 yards. Owen stood up straight and put his hands on his hips with the expression of someone who has solved something that needed solving. "You'll need to tighten the middle anchor every few days," he said. "The rope will stretch." "How do you know that?" "My dad had a water line on our property before we moved to town." Something shifted in his face briefly and then went neutral again. "He showed me." Mira did not press on that. She'd learned enough about how people carried things they didn't want pressed on to know when to leave a door closed. "Your grandmother's going to wonder where you are," she said. "She knows I get into things," he said, which was clearly a direct quote from someone else, delivered with the confidence of a sentence he'd heard, applied to himself many times. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Mira had approximately 15 reasons why a 10-year-old underfoot on a failing farm with a ravine full of sick chickens was a complication she didn't need. "Come in the morning," she said. Before the heat, June announced itself like something that had been building patience all spring and finally ran out. The temperature on the 1st of June hit levels that made the May heat look like an apology. The sky turned that particular shade of pale blue that looked beautiful and meant nothing good, the color of a sky with no moisture in it, a sky that had forgotten how to rain. Creek outside town dropped to a series of disconnected puddles. The farmers who had been worried in May started making the face of people who had moved past worries to something grimmer and more practical. In Cinder Hollow, the first laying hens started to fail. Not dramatically, not all at once. But the morning egg counts that people depended on started dropping and then dropping more. A woman named Clara Fitch, who kept 24 hens on the south side of town, came up empty on a Tuesday, and then again on Wednesday. Eli Branch, who supplied eggs to the hotel through a standing arrangement, showed up to make his delivery with half what he'd promised and no good explanation except the heat and the feed costs and the way his birds had just stopped. This was the kind of news that travels fast in a small town, and it traveled with a particular edge of anxiety because eggs were not a luxury in Cinder Hollow in the summer of a drought. They were the thing that stretched a food supply when meat was expensive and garden yields were failing. For breakfast, were dark, They were breakfast, and they were baking, and they were the small, reliable daily thing that people depended on without thinking about it until it wasn't there. Mira knew this was happening because Tilda told her, and because Owen came to the farm each morning with scraps of information he'd collected from his grandmother's conversations, and the market, and the things adults said when they thought a child wasn't paying attention. Owen was excellent at appearing not to pay attention. Mr. Branch is going to have to tell the hotel he can't supply anymore, he reported one morning, appearing at the ravine edge while Mira was doing her daily check of the flock. My grandmother heard from his wife. He's down to maybe a dozen eggs a day. And that's not enough for the hotel kitchen. Most of its windows were dark. Mira was crouched next to the water containers, checking levels, watching the birds that moved around her with increasing confidence. She had 43 birds now, 3 lost that first night, none since. By the end of the second week of June, the improvement had been gradual, and then, suddenly, not gradual at all. The birds had turned a corner in the way that recovering things sometimes do, where you watch for days and see nothing, and then, one morning, everything is different. They were eating properly. They were drinking. They were moving through the ravine with the alert, purposeful motion of healthy chickens rather than the slow drift of exhausted ones. And they were investigating the nesting boxes Mira had built into the ravine walls. Not laying yet, it would be another week, maybe 2, before their systems regulated enough for that. But they were looking. They were interested. They were behaving like birds that intended to stay. 3 days ago, he had 40 eggs. Owen continued from the ravine edge above her. Now 12, that's fast. He'll do that, Mirasa said. Once it gets into their system, it disrupts everything. Why aren't yours doing that? She stood up and looked at him. He was sitting with his legs dangling over the edge, which she'd told him not to do twice, and he'd done it again anyway, which she'd decided to pick her battles about. The shade, she said. The depth. The moisture in these walls keeps the air temperature in here lower than up top. Their bodies aren't fighting the heat, so they've got something left for everything else. Owen looked around the ravine with the expression of someone recalculating something. So the bad land is actually the good land. Mira thought about scorchback ground, about 2 previous owners walking away, about what Harlan Pike had paid for it versus she had paid, years later when it had sat empty long enough that the price had dropped twice more. Sometimes, she said, what looks useless is just useful in a way nobody's figured out yet. Owen considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. My grandmother says something like that, he said. She says people throw away more good things than bad ones. Your grandmother, Mira said, is usually right. It was Owen who found the first egg. He came down the ravine access rope. He'd gotten confident enough to use it as a ladder, which made Myra's heart seize every time. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of June, went directly to the nesting boxes, the way he did every morning as part of the routine they established, and came back to where Mira was mixing feed with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was the expression of someone holding something they're afraid to drop. In his palm, on a folded piece of cloth he'd grabbed from the supply shelf he'd learned early, that bare hands sometimes broke them, sat a single egg. It was pale blue, not dramatically, not the blue of sky or paint, a soft, quiet blue-gray, like the inside of a mussel shell, like the color the air goes just before a storm clears. Small, neat, perfect. Mira looked at it for a long moment without speaking. It was in the 3rd box, Owen said, the one closest to the north wall. She reached out carefully and took it from the cloth. It was warm and slightly rough-surfaced and real, and she held it in her palm and felt the specific weight of something she'd been working toward for 3 weeks, without knowing if it would ever actually arrive. There she is, Mira said quietly. Not to Owen, not to anyone in particular. Owens was quiet for a moment, respectful of whatever was happening in Mira's face, that he probably didn't entirely understand but recognized as important. Then he said, is it supposed to be blue? Yes, Mira said. Is that good? That, Mira said, is very good. She set the egg back on the cloth with the care of someone who understood what it represented, and she looked at the nesting boxes, and she looked at the 43 birds moving through the cool shade below her, and she thought, Tilda was right. She thought, all right. She thought, now we work. The next morning there were 4 eggs. The morning after that, 9. By the end of the 3rd week of June, there were 22 in a single morning, and Mira was collecting them in a lined basket and setting them in the coolest corner of her root cellar and trying to think clearly about what came next. She had not told anyone in town. Not yet. Not because she was hiding anything exactly. More because she had learned, from 2 years of being the subject of other people's assumptions, that the moment you announced something, you handed other people the right to tell you all the ways it wasn't going to work out. She wasn't ready for that conversation. She needed more time to understand what she actually had before she let anyone else form opinions about it. The only people who knew were Tilda and Owen, and Tilda had the wisdom to keep her counsel, and Owen was 10 years old with no particular reason to advertise anything to people he mostly considered boring. But the eggs kept coming, and the rest of Cinder Hollow kept losing theirs. The hotel situation became a genuine crisis by the last week of June. Kitchen manager, a sharp-tempered woman named Rose Alderman, had started rationing eggs for guest breakfasts and had cut the baking menu down by half. The manager of the hotel itself was furious, in the particular way that men who run establishments are furious not loudly, but steadily and in ways that affected other people's livelihoods. It was through this network of frustration and shortage that Bennett Shaw arrived in Cinder Hollow. Shaw was a traveling cook. That was the simplest way to describe him, though the description was inadequate. He worked for a hotel company based out of Denver that operated 6 properties in different territory towns, moving between them as needed, consulting on menus, training local kitchen staff, occasionally taking over operations when a head cook left suddenly. He was 35, compact, efficient, with the slightly impatient manner of a man who had spent most of his adult life in kitchens where every second had a cost attached to it. He had come to Cinder Hollow's hotel on business. The head cook had quit in early June, abruptly, citing reasons that were probably several reasons combined, and his wagon had broken an axle on the main road 4 miles east of town. He arrived in Cinder Hollow 3 hours late, irritable, covered in road dust, and immediately presented with the additional problem that the hotel he'd come to sort out was also in the middle of an egg crisis. He was not accustomed to ingredient problems he couldn't solve. He had cooked in places with worse supply chains than a Wyoming territory town. He had always found a way to source what he needed. Started asking questions. He asked the market vendor. He asked the feed store owner. He asked Rose Alderman, who told him flatly that there were no eggs in Cinder Hollow worth purchasing and hadn't been for weeks, and if he could find some, she would love to know where. Then he asked the boy, who was sitting on the fence outside the hotel, doing nothing obvious, who turned out to be Owen Rusk. Owen, to his credit, did not immediately give anything away. He looked at Shaw with the careful assessment of a child who has been trusted with something and is deciding whether this stranger deserves any portion of that trust. "Why do you want eggs?" Owen asked. "Because I cook," Shaw said, with the tone of a man who considers this self-evident. "Lots of people cook. I cook for 40 people a day, 3 meals, and right now I can't make anything that requires his eggs, which is approximately half of everything on the menu." Owen thought about this. "What would you pay?" he asked. Shaw looked at him more carefully now. "That depends on what's available. What if I could find out?" "Then I'd say find out, and come back to me with a number." Owen got off the fence. "I'll be back tomorrow morning," he said, and he was gone before Shaw could respond. Majora was not pleased when Owen arrived the next morning with the news that he'd been negotiating on her behalf with a stranger who wanted eggs. "Owen." She said his name in the flat tone that meant, "Explain yourself." He did, with the efficiency of someone who has rehearsed the explanation and believes it holds up. Shaw's credentials, the hotel situation, the number of meals. The fact that the man had asked what she'd be paid, which Owen took as a sign he was serious. Mira listened to all of it without expression. "You told a stranger where to find me," she said when he was done. "I didn't tell him where to find you. I told him I'd come back to him with information." Owen drew himself up with the dignity of someone who considers the distinction significant. "I didn't give him anything yet." "But you're telling me to meet him. I'm telling you someone wants to buy eggs and has money to spend and has no other options." Owen held her gaze. "And you have eggs." Mira looked at the basket on the root cellar shelf. She'd collected 31 that morning. The flock was finding its rhythm. She thought about her debts, the feed store account, tax assessment in September, the well casing repair she'd been putting off for 2 months because she couldn't afford the parts. What's his name? She asked. Bennett Shaw. He cooks for the hotel company. Where's he staying? The obviously. Don't be smart. Sorry. He didn't look particularly sorry. She went to the hotel the following morning, early enough that the dining room was still being set for breakfast. She brought 6 eggs in a cloth bag, not to sell, but to show. She'd learned enough from 2 years of trying to move things at market to know that people needed to see what they were considering. Shaw was in the kitchen when she arrived, already working, his sleeves rolled up, moving between stations with the focused economy of someone who doesn't waste motion. He looked up when Rose Alderman brought Mira in, and he read the cloth bag immediately. You're the woman with eggs, he said. I'm Mira Bellamy, she said. I have a farm outside town, the Scorchback place. He said it neutrally, just placing the geography, and she noted that he either didn't know the local opinion of her land or didn't care about it, and either way, that was fine. Show me. She set the 6 eggs on the clean section of the work table. Shaw looked at them without touching them for a moment, the particular attention of someone who assesses things for a living. Then he picked one up and held it toward the light from the kitchen window. The pale blue shell caught the morning light and held it differently than an ordinary egg would. Shaw turned it once, twice. He said nothing. May I? He gestured toward the stove. It's your kitchen, she said. He cracked it into a clean pan, careful, deliberate, and the yolk that came out was the deep orange yellow of late afternoon sun, nothing like the pale yellow of an ordinary commercial egg. It sat high and round and firm. Shaw looked at it for 5 full seconds. Then he looked at Mira. How many birds do you have? He said. 43 producing hens. How many eggs per day right now? 30 to 35. Going up. Could you get to 60? Not immediately. In time, maybe. Shaw turned back to the pan and finished cooking the egg quickly, efficiently, and ate a piece of it off the spatula with the critical focus of someone conducting an evaluation. He stood there chewing with his eyes slightly unfocused, the way people look when they're tasting something carefully. These are exceptional, he said. It came out matter of fact, not a compliment exactly, more like a technical assessment. The yolk quality is significantly above standard. Rich, stable. These'll hold through high heat cooking without breaking down the way inferior eggs do. He set the spatula down. What are you getting for them? I haven't sold any yet. He looked at her. Why not? I was waiting until I understood what I had. Something shifted in his expression, a small recalibration. The look of a professional recognizing something in another professional. Smart, he said. Then immediately I want to buy everything you produce. All of it. I'll pay 3 times market rate. The number hit Mira somewhere in the chest. She kept her face steady. 3 times market rate for as long as I can supply? She said. For as long as the quality holds at this level. He crossed his arms. I also want to put you in contact with our Denver office. If we can establish a reliable supply, we have 5 other properties that would pay for this quality. I'm talking about a contract, not just a handshake. The room went quiet. Rose Alderman, who had been pretending to organize something on a shelf across the kitchen, was very still. Mira thought about 43 birds in a ravine on a piece of land everyone had written off. She thought about 3 weeks of hauling water and mixing soaked grain and climbing the oak tree and lying on the ravine edge in the dark, listening for the sound of birds still breathing. She thought about Orson Vane's face in the market square. She thought about the laughter. I need a few days to see what my volume looks like, she said. I'll have a clearer number for you by Friday. Friday, Shaw agreed and extended his hand. She shook it. She did not go directly home. She walked instead to the edge of the market square, the way she sometimes did when she needed to think, and the farmhouse felt too small for what was happening in her head. The square was mostly empty at this hour, a few vendors setting up early, a woman with a cart of melons, the usual morning sounds of a town waking itself up. The Satsevitz. She sat on the bench at the edge of the square and looked at the place where Harlan Pike had stood with his crates of dying birds, and she thought about all the things that had happened in the 5 weeks since that morning. 3 dead overnight, 43 surviving. The pulley system Owen had rigged, the pale blue of the first egg in his careful hands, the yolk in Shaw's pan going deep orange in the morning light. She thought, I need to tell Tilda, she thought, I need to figure out the tax situation before September. She thought, 3 times market rate. She was sitting there doing arithmetic in her head, the kind that had looked impossible a month ago, and now looked merely very difficult, which was a significant improvement when she became aware that someone was watching her from across the square. She looked up. Orson Vane was standing at the entrance to the grain exchange, a ledger under his arm, watching her with an expression she couldn't read from this distance. Not friendly, not hostile, something more considered than either. He had heard, she thought, or he was about to. In a town this size, with a hotel kitchen manager like Rose Alderman, who had not been pretending to organize anything on that shelf, word would move fast. The laughter had been loud and wide back in May. News that the fat woman's worthless chickens were producing the only eggs in the county at 3 times market rate, and a hotel company from Denver was talking about a contract that was going to travel even faster. Mira looked back at Vane across the square. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. She just looked at him, steady and calm, for 3 full seconds. Then she stood up and walked back toward her cart, and she had the feed store account and the tax assessment and the well casing repair all lined up in her head. And for the first time, in 2 years of trying to hold scorched background together with her hands and her stubbornness and very little else, the numbers were starting to move in a direction that didn't feel like disaster. Behind her, in the grain exchange doorway, Orson Vane watched her go, and whatever he was calculating behind those careful eyes had not yet finished calculating. That Friday, she brought Shaw 38 eggs and a number. He looked at the number. He looked at the eggs. He said, "We have a deal," and sent a letter to Denver that afternoon. By the following Tuesday, Mira had cleared the feed store account entirely, paid down the largest portion of her remaining debt, and ordered the parts for the well casing repair. She sat at her kitchen table that evening, with the tin box open in front of her, and the paper from the first night unfolded beside a new sheet, and she looked at the 2 columns for a long time. What she'd owed, what she'd paid, what remained. It wasn't nothing. It was a long way from nothing, but it was no longer the kind of number that woke her up at 3 in the morning with her heart going too fast and the ceiling pressing down. Owen came by the next morning, and she told him what had happened with the contract. He listened with the serious attention gave to everything that mattered to him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does this mean the farm is going to be okay?" Mira looked at him. She thought about everything she'd learned from 2 years, of trying to say the right thing about uncertain situations, about the cost of promises made before the ground was solid, about what false comfort did to people who then had to face reality anyway. "It means it's better than it was," she said. "That's real. That I can say, for certain." Owen nodded. He seemed to accept that, which made her think he was old enough to understand that better than it was could be everything, when where it was before had been bad enough. They walked down to the ravine together in the early morning quiet, and below them, in the shaded cool, the flock moved through the morning with the ease of animals that had settled into a place and decided to stay. Pale blue eggs were in the nesting boxes, one by one, accumulating the way reliable things do not in a flood, not in a miracle, just steadily, day after day, the result of 3 weeks of brutal work and one crucial act of noticing something in a dying bird that everyone else had already decided was beyond noticing. The 43 hens that everyone in Cinder Hollow had watched being loaded onto a battered cart by a woman they'd already written off were laying eggs. They were the only hens in the county that were. And in the doorway of the grain exchange, half a mile away, a man who controlled a great deal of what this town needed to survive was watching the direction of the wind change, and thinking about what that might mean for him and what he might need to do about it before it changed any further. The letter from Denver arrived on a Thursday. Mira read it twice at the kitchen table, then folded it carefully and put it in the tin box on top of everything else. The hotel company wanted to formalize the arrangement a 6-month contract, minimum daily delivery, the price per egg fixed at the agreed rate, regardless of market fluctuation. It was more security than she'd had in 2 years of farming. It was more security than she'd had in most of her adult life. She should have felt relieved. She did feel relieved, in the way that you feel relieved when a bone sets correctly, the pain doesn't stop. It just changes character. There was still the well casing to finish repairing. Still, the east wall of the chicken run to reinforce before the birds got comfortable enough to test the boundaries, which they were already starting to do. Still the September tax assessment, which even with the contract money would be tight. And there was still Orson Vane. She had not forgotten the way he'd watched her from the grain exchange doorway. She had not forgotten, either, that men like Vane did not simply watch. They studied, they calculated, they waited for the right angle, and then they moved. She had been in Cinder Hollow long enough to know how he operated. He didn't come at things directly when indirect was available. Most of its windows were dark. He'd lent money to half the farmers in the county at rates that seemed manageable until they weren't. And by the time a man realized the terms were going to eat him, Vane already had so many threads in the situation that pulling any one of them just tightened the rest. He controlled feed prices through his supply contracts. He had the ear of the county assessor. He was the kind of man who understood that real power was not about what you owned, it was about what other people needed and whether they could get it without going through you. For 2 years, Mira had been careful to minimize her dependence on him. She bought feed from the northern trader when she could get it, from Tilda's surplus when Tilda had extra from Vane's store only when there was no other option. She had avoided his credit arrangements entirely, even in the months when cash was so short that the alternative was eating less herself. She had understood instinctively that owing Vane was a different category of debt than owing anyone else. It was not just money, it was access. It was the right to exist on your own terms in this particular piece of territory. Now she had something he hadn't anticipated, and she watched him across that market square. And she knew the way you know a weather change before the clouds fully form that the watching was over. He was going to move soon. He came on a Tuesday morning in early July, not alone. He brought with him a man she recognized, but didn't know well, Clement Briggs, who ran errands for Vane and had the look of a person who had traded his own judgment for someone else's approval long enough that the trade had become permanent. 2 of them at the gate of scorchback ground, Vane in front, Briggs slightly behind and to the left, which was where he always positioned himself. Mira had noticed like a punctuation mark that didn't know what sentence it belonged to. It was 8 in the morning. She was in the middle of the morning collection. She saw them from the ravine edge, climbed up, set her basket down, and walked to the gate. She did not open it. Vane looked at her across the gate with an expression of practiced friendliness that did not reach his eyes. He was a large man himself, not heavy, but broad and tall, with the kind of physical presence that he had clearly learned to use as a tool. Most people, Mira had observed, took a half step back when Vane moved toward them, even in a neutral situation. She had trained herself out of that reflex in the first year she'd lived here. "Miss Bellamy," he said. "Beautiful morning, Mr. Vane." She kept her hands loose at her sides. "What can I do for you?" He smiled at the directness in a way that suggested he found it charming rather than inconvenient, which was its own kind of condescension. "I've been hearing things about your operation out here," he said. "Good things. Seems you've turned those birds around considerably." "They turned themselves around," she said. "I just gave them the conditions." "Modest," he said. "I respect that." He glanced past her toward the ravine, though he couldn't see much from the gate. "I was hoping we might talk about a business arrangement, something that would benefit both of us." Mira looked at him. She had known this was coming. Knowing it was coming did not make it easier to stand here and listen to it, but it made her steadier. What kind of arrangement? Simple. 1. He put one hand on the gatepost, easy and relaxed, the posture of a man who considers himself welcome. "I'd like to purchase the flock. All of them. Fair market price, better than fair, I'd go generously above. And then, I'd like exclusive rights to the egg production going forward. You'd stay on and manage the operation, of course. I'd pay a manager's wage." She let the silence sit for a moment. "You want to own my chickens," she said, "and pay me to work them. I want to invest in what you've built here," he said. "You've done the hard part. The rebuilding, the conditioning, that work is done. Now it's about scaling the operation and distributing appropriately, and that's where I have the resources and the relationships that you—" He paused, with the careful politeness of someone choosing words that's wound precisely without drawing blood. "May not have access to at present. I have a contract with a Denver hotel company," she said. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and controlled, but there. He had known about the contract. She had assumed he would. What she was watching for was what knowing it had not prepared him for, and she saw it now He'd expected her to be further from solid ground than she was. He'd expected a woman who was still scrambling. One contract, he said, recovering smoothly. With one company. What I'm offering would give you stability across multiple relationships, protection against. I know what you're offering, Mr. Vane, she said, and I know what it would mean. If you own the birds and the production rights, then every family in this county that needs eggs this summer comes through you to get them. He held her gaze. The friendliness in his expression thinned, just slightly, just at the edges. That's a simplistic way to look at a business arrangement. It's the accurate way, she said. A beat of silence. A crow called somewhere across the property and then went quiet. You're turning me down, he said. Not a question. I'm turning you down, she confirmed. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who is filing information rather than accepting a conclusion. I hope you won't regret it, he said. And the words carried the particular weight of a sentence that has two meanings and intends both of them. I appreciate you coming by, Mira said, which was the most neutral thing she could find to say that was still technically true. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned and walked back toward the road, and Briggs followed him like a shadow, like a shadow that had learned to walk upright. And Mira stood at the gate and watched them go and felt the specific chill of knowing that the polite phase of something had just ended. She was at Tilda's within the hour. Tilda listened without interrupting, which was what Tilda did when something was serious. She sat at her kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on Mira's face, and she let the whole account come out without a single comment until Mira was done. Then she said, "How much of your tax record is in order?" Of everything she might have said, it was not what Mira expected. What? Your property tax, the assessment records, the original deed, everything tied to your ownership of scorchback ground. Tilda's voice was precise. Is it all documented and accessible? Mira thought. The deed is in the tin box. Tax records, I have receipts going back to purchase. The assessments have been, she stopped. The September assessment. Edgar Sloan does the county assessments, Tilda said. He has done them for 11 years. Orson Vane has been his largest personal creditor for 9 of those years. She said it flatly, without elaboration, the way you state a fact that speaks for itself. Mira sat back in her chair and felt the shape of it settle into place. He'd have the assessment manipulated. I can't say for certain what he'd do, Tilda said carefully. But if I were in your position, I would have every paper in perfect order. I would get an independent valuation of the property from someone outside this county, and I would make absolutely sure that any agreement you have with the Denver company is in writing and witnessed. Contract is in writing. Good. Keep a copy somewhere that isn't your farmhouse. Mira looked at her. Why not the farmhouse? Tilda met her eyes and said nothing, and the nothing was answer enough. Mira took a slow breath. He'd go that far. I don't know what Orson Vane would go to when he's decided he wants something, Tilda said. I know he's gotten everything he's decided he wanted for the last 15 years. I know the people who said no to him early on had a way of finding things difficult shortly after. She paused. I know you're not the same kind of person as most of those people, and I know that matters. But it doesn't change what he has access to. The kitchen was quiet, except for the tick of the clock on the mantel. Outside, the July heat was already building. It wasn't yet 9 in the morning, and the air was thick with it. The kind of heat that suggested the afternoon would be genuinely dangerous. What would you do, Mira asked, if you were me? Tilda was quiet for a moment. I would not make it easy for him to isolate you, she said. The worst thing you can be right now is a woman alone on 5 acres with something valuable that he wants. The more people understand what you're doing out there, the more she searched for the right word. Witnessed you are. The harder it is to move against you quietly. Mira thought about Shaw, about the hotel, about the families she knew were struggling with the egg shortage, about Harlan Pike, who had given her the birds, and what it might mean to Harlan to know what those birds had become. I've been quiet about it, she said. I know, Tilda said. You had good reason. That reason has changed. The heat peaked in the second week of July and did not come down. Wells that had been low went dry. A family on the eastern edge of the settlement, the Corrigans, lost their well entirely on a Wednesday and had to haul water from the creek puddles by wagon, which was a half-day round trip they could not afford to make every day, and which was also the water that everyone else still dependent on the creek was using. A ration conflict started almost immediately and was ugly and personal in the way that conflicts over survival always are. Gardens that had been struggling gave up. Melons shriveled. The potato crop that people had counted on for winter stores was coming in early and undersized, and that was the farms where it was coming in at all. And the eggs were simply gone. Not reduced anymore. Gone. Clara Fitch had 4 hens still producing sporadically. Eli Branch had stopped counting because the number was too small to matter. Every other flock in the area had shut down completely or been slaughtered to cut feed costs, because feeding animals that produced nothing was a luxury the drought had revoked. Mira's 43 hens laid 41 eggs on the worst day of that second week. 41 eggs when the rest of the county was producing nearly 0. She fulfilled her daily contract with Shaw and the hotel, and she still had surplus. She had begun selling the surplus quietly to Tilda first, then to 2 families Tilda vouched for, then carefully, one at a time, to others. She was not running a storefront. She was not advertising. But word moved the way it always moved in a small drought-stricken town, on the breath of people who needed something and had found it, passed from one ear to the next. The morning Harlan Pike came to her gate. She was not surprised to see him. She had been expecting it for a week. He was alone this time. No sons, no hands. Just Harlan on foot, his hat in his hands, which was a gesture she understood the cost of from a man like Harlan. He was not a man who held his hat to people easily. Miss Bellamy. His voice was rough, and not from the heat. Harlan. He looked past her toward the property, past the farmhouse, past the oak, toward the east where the ravine was. From here you couldn't see the birds, but you could hear them, faintly. Particular busy sound of a healthy flock. I heard they came back, he said. They did. He was quiet for a moment. The hat moved through his fingers. I've got 3 kids, he said. My youngest is 8. We've got dried stores, but they won't last more than another 4 weeks if this heat keeps on, and I've got no eggs, no garden to speak of anymore. And the cattle are costing me more water than they're worth, but I can't sell them because nobody has money to buy livestock right now. He stopped. The words had come out in a rush, and he seemed to find that humiliating, because his jaw tightened after. I'm not asking for charity, he said. I'm asking if there's anything you can sell. Mira looked at him. She thought about the market square in late May. She thought about his voice, they're not worth money, lady, and the laughter that had followed her to the cart. She thought about what it would feel like to stand in front of a gate and ask for help from someone you had dismissed, and what that cost a person. She could have made him feel it. She had the standing to. She didn't want to. How many in your house? She said. 5. 3 kids, me, and my mother-in-law. Come back tomorrow morning, she said. 6 eggs. I'll start you at 6, and we'll see how the count holds. He looked at her. Something in his face changed in a way that he was clearly trying to control and couldn't entirely. And the price? Pay me when the rains come back, she said. Whatever you have then. His jaw worked. He put his hat back on, and she could see it was partly so that she couldn't see his face clearly for a moment. When he'd got it settled, he looked at her directly. I don't know what to say to you, he said. You don't have to say anything, she said. I'll see you tomorrow. He nodded and walked back toward the road, and Mira watched him go and felt the particular weight of a choice made well not comfortable, not simple, but right in the way that some things are right, even when they're inconvenient. Other families came. Not a flood, she wasn't equipped for a flood, and she didn't have enough surplus to serve the entire settlement. But one by one, over the following 2 weeks, people appeared at her gate. Some of them she knew. Some of them she knew mainly as faces from the market square in late May, connected in her memory to laughter she had not answered. She did not refuse a single one. She rationed carefully. She tracked what she had and what she'd committed. She was precise about it. She could not afford to be generous beyond what she could sustain without compromising her ability to sustain anything. She gave 6 eggs to Harlan. She gave 4 to the Corrigan family after their well failed. She gave 3 to a widow named Agnes Poole, who had come to the gate on a Wednesday afternoon, looking like she'd spent several days deciding whether to come at all. And she kept her contract with Shaw, every day, without fail. Because the contract was not just income, it was standing. It was the thing that had taken her from an isolated woman with a strange flock to a producer with documented relationships and a paper trail that went beyond the borders of Cinder Hollow. Owen understood this without being told. He had started coming every day, instead of 3 times a week, arriving early and staying until the heat made outdoor work impossible, and then retreating to the shade of the farmhouse porch where he read whatever Mira had on the shelf or simply sat and thought in the self-contained way he had. His grandmother knew he was at the farm. Mira had spoken to Tilda about it, and Tilda had spoken to the grandmother, and an arrangement had been reached that nobody formally described as an arrangement. He was helping. He was fed when he was here, which was more than sometimes at home. That was the real shape of it. One afternoon in the 3rd week of July, Owen was organizing the record book. Mira had started keeping egg counts, deliveries, payments, dates, and he looked up and said, "Someone's been walking your east fence line." Mira turned from the work table where she was fixing a split in one of the nesting box frames. "What?" "The grass on the east side along the fence. It's been pressed down in a line. I saw it 2 days ago and thought it was an animal, but it's the same line today. And animals don't walk the same exact line twice." He said it with the certainty of someone who has spent enough time outdoors to know the difference. Mira put down the nesting frame. She went out to the east fence line and looked. Owen was right. The grass was pressed in a way that was consistent and directional, not the random browsing pattern of a deer or a wandering dog, but the deliberate repeated track of someone walking the same path, following the fence. Looking, she stood there in the July heat and looked at the track and thought about what Tilda had said. Make sure it isn't easy to move against you quietly. She went back inside and wrote a letter to the Denver company that afternoon. She detailed her current operation, the flock size, the daily production numbers, the contract she was fulfilling. She described scorchback ground and its location. She wrote clearly and precisely. At the end she wrote, "I am sending this as a record of current operations in the event that any dispute arises regarding the property or this agreement. Please retain this correspondence." She sent it with the next morning's delivery through Shaw. Then she paid a visit to a man named Tom Garrett, who was a surveyor and not a friend of Vane's. He was from a different county originally and had no financial ties to anyone in Cinder Hollow that she knew of. She asked him for an independent assessment of her property's value. He said he'd come the following Thursday. She was doing what Tilda had said. She was getting witnessed. What she did not anticipate was how quickly things would escalate after that. She had thought Vane would be methodical. She had thought he would build his approach over weeks, that she would see it coming in stages, that she would have time to respond to each move before the next one landed. She was wrong about the timeline. On the last Thursday of July, she arrived at the gate of her own property to find 2 men there who were not Clement Briggs and were not anyone she recognized. Large, quiet men with the particular patience of people being paid to stand somewhere and wait. Behind them, at the far end of the road, was Vane's wagon, and beside Vane's wagon, talking to Vane, was Edgar Sloan, county assessor, 11 years in the position, 9 of those years with Vane as his largest personal creditor. Mira stopped walking. She was 30 yards from the gate. She had her morning collection dark. She had her morning collection in her hands, and her boots were muddy from the ravine, and the heat was already past tolerating, and she stood there for 3 seconds and understood exactly what she was looking at. They hadn't come to negotiate. The negotiating was the week before. This was the next step. Sloan had a ledger under his arm and a measuring chain coiled over his shoulder. He was here to do an assessment, and the assessment he produced would be whatever number Vane needed it to be, high enough to create a tax liability that Mira couldn't meet, high enough to give the county grounds to act, high enough to put scorchback ground in play. She kept walking. She came to the gate, and the 2 men moved slightly, not blocking but present, and she opened the gate herself without acknowledging them, and stepped through and walked toward Vane and Sloan on the road. Vane watched her come. His expression was different from the last time. The friendliness was completely gone now, replaced by something more efficient. This was business in its more honest form. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "I'm sorry to interrupt your morning." "Mr. Sloan," she said, addressing the assessor directly, ignoring the greeting. "Is there a scheduled assessment of this property that I wasn't informed of?" Sloan had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. He was a small man, tidy, with the air of someone who had built his entire sense of safety on the concept of following procedure, while never examining whose procedure he was following. "We do conduct unannounced assessments when there's reason to believe a property's value has changed significantly, he said. Is there a specific trigger for this assessment? A complaint? A request? It's a glanced at Vane. It's a routine re-evaluation, Vane said smoothly, picking up the thread. Given how active your operation has become, it's simply prudent for the county to ensure the assessment reflects current value. My last assessment was in September, Mira said. I'm not due for another until this coming September. As Edgar mentioned, unusual activity can prompt an interim review, Vane said. She looked at him. She looked at Sloane. She looked at the measuring chain on Sloane's shoulder and the ledger under his arm and the two quiet men at her gate and the wagon on the road. She said, I have an independent surveyor scheduled for this property for today. It was not entirely true. Tom Garrett had said Thursday. She had not confirmed a specific time, but the claim landed exactly where she needed it. To land, she watched it hit Vane's expression and flatten something there that had been arranged. A surveyor, Vane said. Tom Garrett from Millhaven. He's on his way. She held Vane's gaze. I'd be happy to have both assessments conducted simultaneously. In fact, I'd welcome it. 2 independent evaluations at the same time would be very clarifying. She put just enough weight on the last word to make it clear she knew what she was saying. Sloane's discomfort had increased visibly. He shifted his weight and glanced at Vane with the expression of a man hoping for instructions. Vane was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was still controlled, but something underneath it had shifted into a register she hadn't heard from him before, harder, flatter. Less performance in it. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be, he said. I'm making it accurate, she said. That shouldn't be a problem. Tom Garrett did not arrive that morning. He arrived the following morning, Thursday proper, after Mira had sent Owen to town with a note the afternoon before explaining the situation and asking if Garrett could come as early as possible. Garrett was a practical man who recognized an urgent request when he read one, and he arrived at 7 in the morning with his equipment and his own assistant, a young man who took notes. Vane did not come back that day, but Sloane did. He appeared at the gate at 9, alone this time, no Vane, no quiet men with his ledger and his chain, and Mira let him in because denying him access to an assessment would look like she had something to hide, which she didn't, and because she wanted Garrett on the property while Sloane conducted whatever assessment he intended to conduct. The 3 of them moved through the property at the same time, taking different sections. Mira followed Sloane. Owen, without being asked, followed Garrett and wrote things down in a second notebook he'd produced from somewhere, keeping his own record of what Garrett recorded. It was the most thoroughly documented 4 hours Scorchback Ground had ever experienced. When Sloane finished, he stood at the gate and looked at his ledger and did not meet Mira's eyes when he said, I'll have the assessment report to the county office within the week. I'll expect a copy, Mira said. That's yes. That's standard. He still wasn't looking at her. Mr. Sloane, she said, and waited until he looked up. I'd encourage you to make sure your numbers are accurate. Mr. Garrett's assessment will be on record with his office in Millhaven. If the 2 evaluations differ significantly, that's a discrepancy someone will want to explain. It was the plainest thing she'd said to anyone in months. There was no softness in it, no room to mistake the point. She watched it land and watched Sloane understand it completely, and watched something behind his eyes recalibrate. He left without another word. Garrett, finishing up on the south boundary, came to where Mira was standing and said, Property's worth a fair amount, from what I can see. That ravine is genuinely valuable. In drought conditions, the moisture retention down there is significant. Previous owners were fools to write it off. Yes, Mira said. They were. I'll have my report to you within 3 days, Garrett said. My office in Millhaven keeps a copy, and I keep a copy, and I can send one to whatever party you designate. Send one to Bennett Shaw at the hotel, Mira said, and one to this address in Denver. She handed him the name and address of the hotel company contact she'd been corresponding with. Garrett looked at the Denver address and then at her with the particular look of a man reassessing what he's walked into. You've got yourself organized, he said. I'm trying, she said, which was the most honest answer she had. Owen came across the property from the direction of the east fence line, his notebook under his arm, and fell into step beside her as Garrett and his assistant packed their equipment. He counted the nesting boxes. Owen said quietly, meaning Sloane. I know. He counted them 3 times. Different numbers each time. Owen's voice was neutral, but his eyes were not. Like he was trying to find a count that worked for something. I know, Mira said again. They walked back toward the ravine. Below, the flock was going about its business in the deep shade, 43 birds moving through their routines, with the complete indifference to human drama that Mira had always found either maddening or soothing depending on the day. Today it was soothing. Something about the sheer continuity of them eating, moving, investigating the nesting boxes. Being alive was a counterweight to the morning's procedural hostility. She climbed down and did the midday check. Water levels adequate. Grain consumed from the morning feed, which meant appetites were normal. 2 birds resting more than the others, which she noted she'd watch them for the next day and see if it continued. The hen with the crooked toe was in the 3rd nesting box, settled in the way that meant she was about to contribute to the egg count night. Mira crouched beside her and waited, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. The hen looked at her with that same one-eyed attention from all the way back at the beginning. "We're still here," Mira said quietly. The hen blinked, shifted, looked at the wall of the nesting box with the focused expression of an animal with immediate business to attend to. Mira stood and climbed back out of the ravine and went to make sure Owen had had something to eat because she'd been so caught up in the morning's events that she'd forgotten entirely. And it was almost noon. He hadn't eaten. He was sitting on the porch with his notebook open, writing down everything from the morning in careful order, making sure nothing was lost. She made cornbread, the last of the current flour supply, which she needed to reorder. She put it on the table and Owen ate 2 pieces without looking up from what he was writing, which was his highest form of comfort and trust. "Mira," he said, when the second piece was gone. He still had his eyes on the notebook. "What?" "That number that he counted. The nesting boxes." He looked up. He knew how many there were before he counted. He was just checking. She looked at him. "What makes you think that?" Because the first time he counted, he barely slowed down. He just walked past them real fast and touched each one. Owen's voice was precise, the way it got when he was working something out. People who are really counting, they stop. They make sure. He didn't stop. He already had the number. He was checking that the number he had was right. Kitchen was quiet. Mira thought about the east fence line. Pressed grass. The same track 2 days in a row. She thought about Vane on the road and the particular way he'd said 46 that day at the market. All 46 of them, the number precise and immediate, without any moment of recollection. She thought, he's been on the property. Not Sloane. Not Briggs. Someone had been walking her east fence line and looking down into her ravine and counting her nesting boxes, and that information had traveled back to Vane, and Vane had been working from it since before he ever came to her gate. She felt a cold steadiness move through her. Not rage, she had learned to be suspicious of rage because it clouded the very thinking she needed. Just clarity. The cold, clear kind. "Good," she said to Owen. "That's good, what you noticed. What does it mean?" "It means we need to know what number he has," she said. "And then we need to make sure, the next time he says it, that everyone around him hears it too." Owen looked at her with the serious attention of someone who doesn't entirely understand the play, but trusts the player. "How do we do that?" Mira picked up her pencil from the table and turned to the record book. She found yesterday's entry and looked at the number she'd written for the morning collection. 184. She'd had a strong day. The full flock producing. It was the single highest day count since the birds had come fully online. She had written it in the record book, and she had said it aloud to Owen when they tallied it, and she was fairly certain that was all. 184. She looked at that number for a long moment. Then she said, "We wait. We keep our records exactly right. We keep a count that only we know." She tapped the page. "And we see if he knows it too." Owen looked at the number, looked at her. Something settled in his face, the expression of a person who has just understood something that changes the shape of everything around it. "And if he does," Owen said slowly. "If he does," Mira said, "then he can't explain how." Most of the cornbread was cooling between them, and the afternoon heat was pressing against the farmhouse's walls, and outside the folds moved slightly, in a hot breeze that offered nothing in the way of relief. And Mira Bellamy sat at her kitchen table with a 10-year-old boy and a record book, and the particular calm of a person who has just found the ground under their feet and intends to stand on it. She closed the record book. She put her hands flat on the table. She waited for whatever was coming next. The waiting was the hardest part. Not because Mira was a patient person by nature, she wasn't, particularly. She had the particular impatience of someone who had spent most of her life watching problems compound while she lacked the resources to address them, which tends to make a person either reckless or precise. And she had chosen precision out of necessity. But waiting when you knew something was coming, when you had set a condition and now had to hold still until it resolved itself, that was a different kind of difficult. It required trusting the setup more than the action, and that did not come naturally to her. She kept her records exactly right. Every morning, the egg count went into the book with the date and the time and the weather conditions, because she had learned from Tilda that detailed records were credibility. And credibility was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you by someone with more money. She wrote in the same pencil, in the same column, in the same hand. She did not skip days. She did not approximate. Owen continued his morning visits and his careful parallel notes in the second notebook, which had become, without anyone formally deciding this, a backup record, the kind of redundancy that Mira had started thinking about in terms Tilda had used, protect what you can't afford to lose. The number from that Tuesday 184 she kept in her head like a stone in a pocket, solid present, waiting to be used. She told no one else. Not Tilda, not Shaw, not the families who came to the gate for their egg allocations. The record book stayed in the farmhouse. Owen's notebook stayed in whatever bag he carried it in, which went home with him every evening. Count lived in two places, the record, and Owen's careful handwriting, and in Mira's memory, where she turned it over sometimes in the evenings when the farmhouse was quiet and the heat was finally beginning to ease. 184. She waited. Sloane's assessment arrived at the county office 8 days after his visit to the property. A copy was delivered to Mira by the county courier, a young man who handed it over with the careful neutrality of someone who understood he was delivering something unpleasant and had been told not to editorialize. She read it at the kitchen table. The number was almost exactly double what the previous year's assessment had been. She sat with it for a long time, long enough for the afternoon light to shift across the table and the shadow of the window frame to move 3 inches along the floor. She was doing arithmetic in her head, not the desperate, subtractive arithmetic of the first weeks, but a more tactical kind. What the new assessment implied in terms of tax liability. What that liability would mean against current income from the contract and the gate sales. Whether she could meet it, she could. Just if nothing broke, if the flock held, if the Denver contract renewed at the same rate. That was a lot of ifs. She took out the copy of Garrett's independent assessment, which had arrived 4 days earlier. His number was less than half of Sloane's. Not dramatically different from the previous assessment he'd noted the ravine's value, had given the land a modest upward revision on that basis, had been precise and professional and entirely accurate. The gap between the two numbers was not a coincidence. It was a message. She put both documents in the tin box. She wrote a letter to the Denver company's legal representative. She had gotten his name, through Shaw, attaching copies of both assessments and explaining the discrepancy. She kept the letter factual and did not editorialize because she had learned that facts, laid plainly side by side, made a more disturbing picture than any amount of interpretation. Then she made herself eat something, because she hadn't since morning, and she went out to do the evening check. Owen was quiet the next morning in the particular way that meant something was bothering him. Mira noticed it during the morning collection, the way he moved through the ravine slightly off his usual rhythm, the way he answered her questions with complete sentences instead of the compressed, efficient reply he normally used when he was focused. Complete sentences from Owen usually meant he was thinking about something else. She waited until they were back up top, basket filled, sitting on the edge of the ravine in the thin morning shade of the oak before the sun got past it. "Say it," she said. He looked at the basket. "I heard something yesterday. In town." He paused. "People are talking about you." "About the assessment. How do they know about the assessment?" "I don't know. But they do. And some of them," he stopped again. "Owen, some of them are saying you brought it on yourself, that you should have taken Mr. Vane's offer when he made it, that you were being prideful, and now the county's going to take the farm anyway." He said it in the flat tone of someone reporting something that disgusts them. Mrs. Alderman said it at the market, and Mr. Briggs was there when she said it, and he didn't correct her. Mira looked out over the property, the pale, stubborn grass, the farmhouse with its new roof section that she'd managed to get done in June, the oak tree at the ravine edge where the pulley rope still ran, sun-faded now, stretched slightly from use. "What did you say?" she asked. "Nothing," Owen said. "I didn't know what to say." She nodded slowly. That was honest, at least. "That's all right," she said. "Sometimes nothing's right. But it's not right that people think you—" He stopped. "Tried again. You've been feeding half the town. You gave Harlan Pike eggs when you could have said no. You could have charged 3 times what you charged any of them. I know. So why are they sayings?" Mira said carefully. "People who are scared look for a version of events. So someone made a mistake that caused the problem. Because if someone made a mistake, then mistakes are avoidable. Which means they're safe if they just don't make that mistake." She looked at him. It's easier than accepting that sometimes a powerful man decides he wants something and makes things difficult for whoever has it. Owen was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "That's a terrible way to think," he said finally. "It's a human way," she said. "It doesn't make them bad people, just frightened ones." He didn't look entirely convinced, which she understood. At 10, the distinction between bad behavior and frightened behavior was not fully convincing. She wasn't entirely convinced by it herself on the harder days. But she had found it more useful than pure anger, so she held on to it. "Mrs. Alderman has 4 kids," Mira said. "Her husband's well went dry last month. She's got nothing coming in, and Vane holds 2 of her store debts." She picked up the egg basket. She's not saying what Briggs wants her to say because she's mean. She's saying it because she needs Vane to be on her side. Owen picked up the rope to help lower the second basket. "What do we do?" he said. Mira looked at the property. She thought about Tilda's words, "Make sure you're witnessed. Make the isolation impossible." "We let people see what's actually here," she said. "All of it. No more quiet. No more keeping to ourselves and hoping it sorts out." She looked at him. "Who do you know in town that talks to everyone?" Owen thought about this with genuine consideration. "Mrs. Fitch," he said. "Clara Fitch. She talks to everyone, and they all listen to her because her husband was the town doctor before he died, and people still have." He searched for the word. "Residual trust," Mira said. "Sure," he said, in the tone of someone accepting a phrase that fits. "Bring her out here," Mira said. "Tomorrow, if she'll come. Tell her I'd like to show her something." Clara Fitch was a small, sharp woman of about 60, who moved quickly and observed everything, and had the particular social authority of a person who has outlived one respected institution, her husband's medical practice, by sheer force of character. She came to scorchback ground the following morning with a bonnet and an expression of careful neutrality that Mira recognized as the face of someone who has heard multiple versions of a story and is withholding judgment until they see for themselves. Mira showed her everything. The ravine, the flock, the nesting boxes. The record book, open to the last 2 weeks of entries, dates, counts, weather notes, delivery tallies. The letter from the Denver company. Garrett's independent assessment, and beside it Sloane's, the 2 numbers side by side on the kitchen table. Clara Fitch looked at all of it without speaking. She was thorough and unhurried, which Mira respected. She asked Kate 2 questions. What breed were the birds, and how long had the ravine been retaining moisture like that? And she listened to the answers completely. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the 2 assessment documents for a long time. "This is a significant discrepancy," she said. "Yes," Mira agreed. "And you have the independent surveyor's documentation on file in Millhaven." "Yes." Clara Fitch folded her hands on the table. She was quiet for another moment. "I knew Edgar Sloane's mother," she said. "She would be ashamed of this." It was the plainest condemnation Mira had heard anyone offer of Sloane's conduct, and it carried more weight coming from Clara Fitch in a quiet kitchen than any public accusation would have. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Mira said. "I just wanted you to see it." Clara looked at her directly. "Yes, you are," she said, without hostility. "You're asking me to be a witness. That's different from doing nothing and different from getting involved, and we both know it." She paused. "I don't object to being a witness. I object to being handled." She let that sit for a second. "You should know I don't like being handled." "I'm not handling you," Mira said. "I'm showing you what's true and letting you decide what to do with it." Clara Fitch looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted just slightly, just at the edges, but unmistakably in the direction of respect. "All right," she said. "I'll have my own copy of these documents, if you don't mind." The week that followed was not dramatic. That was the thing about the kind of influence Clara Fitch carried. It didn't announce itself. It moved through conversations, through the normal commerce of a small-town community in the middle of a crisis, through the casual exchanges at the well and the market and the church steps on Sunday morning. There were no declarations. There were no confrontations. There were just conversations that hadn't mentioned, fact in which certain facts were mentioned, in which two document numbers sat next to each other in people's minds and didn't resolve into anything comfortable. Mira knew it was working when the tone at the gate changed. The families who came for eggs had always been civil, most of them, but there had been, underneath the civility, a kind of tentativeness, a sense of people who were grateful but slightly embarrassed about the gratitude, who had laughed or stayed silent when others laughed and were now accepting help from the person they'd dismissed and didn't quite know how to hold that. The tentativeness had a quality of transaction to it. They were buying something, even when it was being given. By the second week of August, that tentativeness had changed. Harlan Pike came for his weekly allocation and stood at the gate afterward, not leaving, turning his hat in his hands again, but in a different way than before, not the way of a man humbling himself to ask, but the way of a man trying to figure out how to say something that didn't have easy words. "I've been thinking," he said finally. Mira waited. "What Vane's doing the assessment, the pressure he's putting on, you people know about it, more than you think." He looked down at the hat. "The thing is, most people owe him something. Feed credit, or debt, or there's always something. So speaking up feels risky." He looked up. "But some of us don't owe him as much as we did because of what you've given us this summer. That changes the math a little." "You don't owe me anything, Harlan," she said carefully. "I told you to pay when the rains come back." "That's not the kind of owing I mean," he said. She held his gaze, and she understood what he was trying to say, that there was a debt that didn't belong on any ledger, that was owed in a different currency entirely, and he was figuring out what he had that was worth anything in that currency. "I'm not asking you to put yourself at risk," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "That's actually why I'm standing here." He put his hat back on. "I've got 2 sons who can work, and there are things on this property that could use doing." He glanced past her at the farmhouse at the east wall of the chicken run that was still incomplete. At the storage shed roof she'd been meaning to rebrace for a month. Work doesn't put anybody at risk. Work is just work. She looked at him for a moment. "Tomorrow," she said, "bring your sons. Early." Harlan brought his sons, and then the blacksmith came a man named Walt Decker, who had bought eggs from Mira twice, and said nothing extra when he did it, just paid and nodded and left, and now appeared at 6 in the morning with a box of tools and a question about whether the well casing repair was still waiting. It was still waiting. The carpenter came 2 days after that. His name was Robert Pruitt, and he came without being asked, showed up at the property at 7 in the morning and stood at the gate and said, "I heard there's a chicken run that needs finishing." And Mira opened the gate and said, "East wall," and that was the full extent of the conversation. Owen watched all of this with an expression that Mira couldn't entirely read, something between amazement and vindication, the look of a 10-year-old who has been told how things work and is now watching it actually happen in real life. One evening as the light went low and Harlan's sons were finishing the last section of the run wall, with Pruitt supervising, Owen came to stand beside Mira at the edge of the ravine. "They're all coming," he said. "Some of them," she said. "Why now? They didn't come when it was just you struggling." She thought about how to answer that honest without being cynical about it. "People help when they feel like it might matter," she said. "When things are too far gone, or too uncertain, most people wait. They're not bad people. They make calculations." She watched Harlan's older boy bend a piece of fence wire with his hands, working it into the frame. "When things shifted enough that my situation was visible, when Clara Fitch knew, when people started connecting what I'd done for them this summer with what was being done to me, the calculation changed." "That feels like too much to ask of people," Owens said, "that they have to calculate it." "Maybe," Mira said, "but they're here now, that counts." He was quiet for a moment. "It still doesn't feel fair," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not. But fair and real are 2 different things, And right now, I'll take real. It was the last week of July when Vane made his next move, and he made it in public, which Mira had not expected. The market square on a Saturday. She had come with Shaw Bennett. Shaw had been making a point of accompanying her to the Saturday market for the past 3 weeks, partly practical and partly, she understood, a form of visible alliance. A Denver hotel company's representative standing beside you while you conducted business was a kind of credential that operated differently than any document. She was at the market when Vane came into the square with Sloane beside him. And the particular way he moved, purposeful, with an audience in mind, told her immediately that this was not coincidental. Stopped in the middle of the square, in the natural gathering point, where the most people could see and hear, and he spoke loud enough to carry. The county is conducting a supplemental assessment of several properties, he announced. Not to anyone in particular, to the general air of the market. Given the exceptional drought conditions and changes in agricultural productivity, it's a straightforward administrative process. He looked around as if noticing the audience rather than having engineered it. I want to reassure everyone that the county is committed to fair and accurate valuations. Crowd was paying attention. This was the kind of market square announcement that people paid attention to whether they wanted to or not. It had the flavor of official information delivered in a way that invited no questions. Mira stood still. Shaw, beside her, said nothing. He had the watchful stillness of a man who has seen negotiations go bad in many forms and knows when to let something play out. Vane's gaze moved across the square and found Mira. He paused there, deliberate, brief, and then he said, without quite addressing her directly, properties whose operations have grown significantly will, of course, reflect that growth in their assessments. That's simply accurate accounting. The crowd shifted. Eyes moved toward Mira and then away and then back. The social discomfort of a room or a square in which something pointed has been said, and everyone knows who it's pointed at, was palpable. And then Vane said, with the ease of a man producing a fact he's been keeping warm, production of 184 eggs in a single day. For instance, that's a meaningful operation that warrants a meaningful assessment. The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Mira felt the number land, felt the specific weight of it, the precision of it, the way it was not a rounded figure or an approximate claim, but an exact count from a single exact day that she had recorded in her book and spoken aloud to one other person, Owen. In those 2 seconds, she understood everything she needed to understand about how Orson Vane knew what he knew. And in those 2 seconds, she understood that the moment had arrived. She stepped forward. The crowd shifted again, turning toward her, widening slightly in the way crowds do when the person being spoken about decides to speak. Mr. Vane, she said. Her voice was clear and carried without effort. She was not angry. Anger was not the register she needed, and she'd known that since the day at the kitchen table when she'd looked at the number 184 and understood what it was for. Question. He looked at her with the contained expression of a man who had expected this and believes he is prepared for it. 184, she said. That's a very specific number. Your daily count is a matter that your contract has made somewhat. My contract with the Denver company doesn't specify daily counts, she said. It specifies minimum delivery quantities. The 184 figure is not in any document I've submitted publicly. She let that settle. It's not in my contract. It's not in any assessment Miss Sloane conducted. It's not in any document I've given to any party. She looked at Vane steadily. The only record of that specific number is in my private record book, which is in my farmhouse and is in a second notebook kept by my associate. The market square had gone genuinely quiet. Not the polite quiet of people trying not to be noticed listening. The actual quiet of people who have stopped what they were doing. How do you know yesterday's egg count, Mr. Vane? The question was simple. It had one of 2 answers, and both of them were visible in Vane's face before he'd decided which one to attempt the split second of a man whose prepared ground has given way underneath him. He started and stopped. Sources of information in a community are, there are no sources, Mira said, still calm, still clear. My associate is a 10-year-old boy. I have had no other conversations about production counts. The record book has not left my farmhouse. She looked at him, and she let the silence be the rest of the sentence. Someone in the crowd said quietly, to no one in particular, he was on her property. It wasn't an accusation from someone prepared to make one. It was the reflexive statement of a person who had followed the logic to its only conclusion and said it aloud before they'd decided whether to. But once it was said, it was in the air. Vane's composure was still intact. He was not a man who lost composure easily, but the calculation behind his eyes had shifted into a different mode, the mode of a man who is no longer advancing, who is now working out how to stop losing ground. "I'm not," he started. "Mr. Vane." Shaw stepped forward unhurried, with the specific authority of someone who has no local social debts to manage and therefore nothing to lose by being direct. "The lady has asked you a plain question about how you came to know a private figure from her business records. Either you can account for it or you can't." He said it pleasantly, in the same tone he used to assess egg quality professional, without heat, completely serious. More silence. Harlan Pike was at the edge of the crowd. Mira saw him, saw his face, saw the expression of a man watching a situation crystallize into something he'd suspected for some time and now no longer had any reason to pretend otherwise about. Vane said nothing that was an answer. He produced 3 sentences that were not answers, arranged to sound like a response while containing no information that addressed the question, and Mira let him say them, because every word that was not an answer was its own kind of answer, visible to everyone watching. When he stopped, the square was still quiet. Then Clara Fitch said, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, in her clear, unhurried voice, "Edgar, you should know that I have copies of both the county assessment and the Millhaven surveyor's evaluation. The numbers are not close." Sloane, who had been standing slightly behind Vane in the usual way of people in proximity to power, went a particular shade of pale that Mira could see from 20 feet away. The market did not erupt. There were no dramatic declarations. That was not how these things worked in a small community in a crisis year, when most people were tired and frightened and not looking for confrontation. What happened was quieter and in some ways more definitive. People started leaving Vane's orbit, not all at once, not with speeches. They just adjusted. A conversation that would have naturally included him didn't. A question that would have gone to him went elsewhere. Debts that could be settled early were settled, quietly, by people who had found a little cash from an unexpected direction and decided to use it to close an account they'd been uncomfortable with. It happened over the following 10 days in the way that trust erodes, not in one visible break, but in 100 small adjustments that add up to a completely changed landscape. Sloane submitted a revised assessment 3 days after the market. The new number was within 15% of Garrett's still slightly high, but defensible, the kind of number that could be attributed to honest, professional disagreement rather than deliberate manipulation. He sent no explanation for the revision. He didn't need to. Myris received the revised document and added it to the tin box without ceremony. Owen was there when the courier brought it, and he read it over her shoulder and said, "That's better." "It is," Mira said. "Is it over now?" She thought about that carefully, because she had learned to be precise with him. She didn't want to give him false endings. "The immediate thing is handled," she said. "Whether it's over," she shook her head. "Men like Vane don't have a dramatic moment where they give up and admit it. They just," she thought of the right way to put it, "they stop finding it worth the cost. When the cost gets high enough, did we make it high enough?" She looked at the revised assessment. She thought about the market square and the question that had hung in the air without an answer and what that silence had meant to the people watching. She thought about Clara Fitch's voice, clear and steady in the crowd. She thought about Harlan Pike's face. "For now," she said. Yes, Owen seemed to accept this as the honest answer it was. He put the document down and picked up his notebook and opened it to the day's entry, which he hadn't finished writing. Mira went to the window and looked out at the property. The east wall of the chicken run was finished solid, reinforced, ready. The well casing was repaired. The storage shed roof was braced. The ravine sat in its usual deep shade below the oak, and from here she could hear, very faintly, the sound of the flock going about its business. 43 birds. Still alive, still producing. She had not saved them because she was strong or fearless, or without doubt. She had saved them because she'd looked at 46 dying animals on a hot day in a market square and noticed something in them that was still alive. And she had decided that was enough reason to try. She had kept them alive through 7 weeks of brutal heat by hauling water and making feed and watching each bird individually and refusing on every day that it would have been easier to quit. To quit. And they had repaid her in the only currency they had, reliably, every morning, in the cool shade of the ravine that everyone had called worthless. She had not expected the rest of it, the contract, the families at the gate, the market square, and the question that dismantled Vane in front of the town. She had not planned any of that. It had come from the work, only from the work, and from one act of observation on a May morning in a market square when she had looked at a dying bird's legs and thought, wait, that was all it had started with. Wait, let me look, let me think, let me try. Outside in the deepening afternoon, a hawk turned slow circles over the east field, and the pale grass moved in a hot breath of wind, and the oak tree stood at the ravine edge the way it had stood for 40 years before Mira arrived, and would stand for 40 more after, indifferent to all the human machinery playing out around its roots. Mira watched the hawk until it banked away and was gone. Then she went back to the table and made a list of what still needed doing before September. There was plenty. There was always plenty. The work didn't stop because one thing had resolved. The work was the point, the daily, imperfect, necessary work of keeping something alive that deserved to be kept alive, and doing it with the hands you had on the land you had in the season you were given. She wrote until the light failed, and Owen had to light the lamp, and neither of them talked much while she wrote, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him, that he understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed leaving alone. The lamp made its small circle of light in the kitchen, and outside the night came on over scorchback ground, and in the ravine below the oak the 43 birds settled into the dark and the cool and the quiet. They were alive. Tomorrow they would produce. And Mira Bellamy, tired, imperfect, still carrying more debt than she'd like, and more worry than she'd admit, sat at her kitchen table and knew, with the plain, solid certainty of something earned rather than given, that she was going to be all right. The rain came on a Thursday. Not dramatically, not the way rain comes in stories, with lightning and vindication, and the sense of a universe correcting its own mistakes. It came the way most real things come quietly, without announcement, in the early hours before sunrise when Mira was already awake and sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and her lists. She heard it first on the roof, that particular sound that is different from wind, different from anything except what it actually is, and she sat very still for a moment and listened to make sure she wasn't manufacturing it out of wanting. She wasn't. She set her coffee down and went to the door and opened it, and stood on the porch in the dark and let it fall on her face and her hands and the front of her work coat. It was not a heavy rain. It was the tentative kind, the kind that arrives, still deciding whether to commit, that comes and goes in gusts and doesn't soak through right away. But it was rain, real, actual rain, falling on scorchback ground for the first time in 11 weeks. She stood there for a long time. She was not a woman who cried easily, or often she'd had too much practice at swallowing things down to let them rise back up, without warning, but standing on that porch, in the dark with the rain on. She felt something give way in her chest. Not break, give way. The way a knot gives way when you've been working it long enough, and the fibers finally loosen and the thing comes apart in your hands, and you realize how long you'd been holding the tension of it without knowing. She didn't cry. But she stood there longer than was practical, and she let the rain say what she didn't have words for. Then she went back inside and added it to the record book. Date, time, conditions. Because that was what you did. You kept the record. You didn't stop keeping it just because something good happened. Owen arrived at 6:30, which was late for him, and he was soaked through because he had apparently decided that the rain did not warrant changing his usual route or pace. He stood at the farmhouse door with water running off the brim of his hat and an expression of such controlled delight that Mira almost smiled outright, which she managed to convert into something more neutral before it fully arrived on her face. It rained, he said. I noticed, she said, it rained a lot. It rained a moderate amount. Come inside before you put a puddle on my floor. She stepped back, and he came pulling off the soaked hat. She got him a towel from the shelf, and he dried his face with the efficient self-sufficiency he had developed somewhere between May and now without her noticing the transition. Do you think it'll keep going? He asked. I don't know. She poured him coffee, which she'd started doing 3 weeks ago when she'd noticed he was arriving hungry and tired most mornings, and which they had both treated as a completely unremarkable development. Weather doesn't make promises. Tildasa said, "The clouds have been building northwest for 4 days," he said. She said that pattern usually means several days of rain, not just one. "Tilda pays better attention to the sky than anyone I know," Mira said. "Probably right." Owen wrapped both hands around the cup the way Tilda did. It was a gesture he'd picked up unconsciously, and Mira had noticed it weeks ago and found it quietly moving the way children absorb the habits of people they trust, carrying pieces of them forward without realizing it. "Harlan's going to come today," Owen said, "to settle his debt." Mira looked up from her list. "He told me yesterday at the market," Owen said. "He said the rain means the debt is due, and he wanted me to tell you he'd be here this morning." She thought about the evening in July, when Harlan had stood at her gate, turning his hat in his hands, and said he didn't know what to say to her, and she had told him he didn't have to say anything. She had meant it at the time. She had also known, even then, that he would find a way to say something eventually, because that was the kind of man Harlan Pike was underneath the practical exterior, someone for whom debts of the non-ledger variety sat uneasy until they were addressed. "All right," she said. Harlan came at 8, and he did not come alone. He had both his sons, the older one, Thomas, who was 17 and had done most of the fence work in July, and the younger one, Caleb, who was 15 and quieter than his brother and had a habit of watching whatever task was in front of him with the focused patience of someone planning how to do it efficiently before he started. He had his own tools, a coil of good rope, and the third item that confused Mira initially, a small wooden crate, slotted, the kind used for transporting young birds. She looked at the crate. She looked at Harlan. "From my cousin in the hill country," Harlan said, setting it down carefully near the gate. "He's been raising a line related to yours. He got a breeding pair from the same original source, years back. Different line, but same base stock." He paused. "These are 4 young pullets, 8 weeks old. They'll start laying in another 4 or 5 months. He looked at her steadily. "It's not repayment for the eggs. I know that's what I said the debt was for, but the eggs," he stopped and tried again. "The eggs kept my kids fed through the worst 2 months they've had. You can't put a price on that, and I'm not going to insult you by trying. The pullets are they're extra. They're from me." Mira looked at the crate inside, 4 small birds with the characteristic long-backed build, and the early suggestion of that slate-leg coloring moved around each other with the slightly indignant energy of young chickens who had been transported somewhere, unfamiliar, and were not yet sure what to make of it. She thought about 46 dying birds in a market square in late May. She thought about the first pale blue egg in Owen's careful hands. She thought about the hen with the crooked toe, who was still producing, still the most reliable layer in the flock, the one Mira checked first every morning, the one who had looked at her across a water container on the first night in the ravine and decided, apparently, that she would trust this situation. "New blood for the line," she said. "That's what my cousin said. He said the stock gets stronger for the mixing." Mira crouched down and looked through the crate slats at the 4 pullets. One of them looked back at her with an attention that was startlingly familiar, that same focused single-eye assessment, the quality of a bird evaluating what it's looking at, rather than simply reacting to it. "Put them in the quarantine section," she said to Owen, who was already reaching for the crate. "South end of the run, away from the main flock, for 2 weeks before I integrate them." Owen picked up the crate with the practiced ease of someone who had carried a lot of chickens over the past 3 months. "I know," he said, which he did, because she'd told him the quarantine protocol when she'd explained how to manage the flock if she was ever unable to do the morning check herself. She stood up and looked at Harlan. "Thank you," she said. It came out simply, without the weight she'd normally put on words. She meant just the plain statement of a genuine thing. Harlan nodded. He looked like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying and was taking stock of how he felt without the weight of it. "Thomas and Caleb are here for the day," he said. "Whatever needs doing." What needed doing was considerable, and the rain made some of it easier, and some of it harder. The creaks of its windows were dark. The creek had started running again overnight, a thin, fast trickle that would take weeks of consistent rain to return to anything like its normal volume, but it was moving. The ground was softening. The hard, pale crust that had formed over most of the property was beginning to release its grip on itself, and where the soil underneath was good, the change was already visible, a slight darkening, a small, yielding quality that hadn't been there yesterday. Thomas and Caleb worked on the water storage expansion that Mira had been planning since June but hadn't been able to fund fully. She had bought the materials in early August after the Denver contract's first proper payment had come through, and they had been sitting waiting for enough hands to do the job correctly. Walt Decker came around mid-morning without being asked, apparently having heard that Harlan was at the farm, and took over directing the cistern construction with the authority of a man who had built 3 of them and knew where other people went wrong. Mira moved between tasks. She was trying to do too many things at once, which was her habit and her flaw. She had a tendency, when things were finally moving in that direction, to try to accelerate everything simultaneously rather than accepting that some things had their own speed. She caught herself 3 times crossing the property in directions that contradicted each other before she made herself stop at the ravine edge and breathe and organize her actual priorities rather than her anxious ones. Owen appeared beside her. He had developed this habit appearing at her elbow during these moments of overextension, not saying anything, just being there with his notebook open in case she needed to talk through the list out loud. She had not asked him to do this. He had simply started doing it. "Stop," he said. You're doing the thing where you walk back and forth fast and don't finish anything," he said. "I've counted. You've started 4 tasks this morning." She looked at him. He was entirely serious, which was the only way he was capable of saying things like that. "The cistern," she said. "Water storage first. Then the South Run integration prep for the pullets. Then the record update. Then the letter to Denver." Owen wrote it down. "In that order?" "In that order." He handed her the list. She looked at it, 4 things written in his careful handwriting, and felt the particular relief of a person who has been inside their own head too long and has had someone else hold things for them briefly. "Thank you," she said. "You say that too much," he said. "It loses meaning. It doesn't lose meaning if it's true every time." He considered this with the seriousness he gave to things that interested him. "All right," he said, and went to check on the quarantine section. Tilda came in the afternoon, which was unusual. Tilda generally did not make farm visits in wet weather, her knees being what they were on uneven ground. The fact that she made the effort on this particular day, in a light but persistent rain, meant that she had decided it was worth it. And Tilda's decisions about what was worth effort were rarely wrong. She came through the gate with her walking stick and her good coat and the expression of a woman doing exactly what she intended to do. Mira met her at the gate, and they walked together toward the farmhouse, moving slowly in deference to the muddy ground, and Tilda's pace, which was not fast on the best of days, and was careful today. "The creek's running," Tilda said, looking in that direction. "Since last night." "Good." Tilda looked around at the property, the cistern work in progress, Harlan's son, Decker's box of tools, Owen visible near the South Run. "You've got people here." Harlan came to settle his debt. What form did it take? His son's work and 4 pullets from his cousin's line. Tilda stopped walking and looked at her. 4 pullets from the hill country stock? He said, "It's related to mine. Same original source, different line." Tilda was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when something pleased her more than she wanted to immediately show. "That's a good thing," she said finally. "Better than good. Mixing lines from the same base stock at the right generation distance strengthens the breed characteristics. Your flock in 2 years will be—" She stopped herself. "It's a good thing," she said again, more simply. They went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and Mira made tea because the rain had put a damp chill in the air that the season had not prepared anyone for, and for a few minutes they sat in the comfortable silence they had developed over 2 years of neighboring, which was a specific and valuable kind of quiet. "I want to talk about Owen," Tilda said. Mira looked up. "His grandmother is not well," Tilda said carefully. "She hasn't been well for some time. She's been managing, but she put her cup down. She told me 2 weeks ago that she doesn't know how much longer she can keep managing. She was asking me, in the indirect way, of someone who doesn't want to ask directly, whether Owen had a place to be." The kitchen was quiet, except for the rain on the roof and the distant sounds of work from the cistern area. Mira looked at her tea. She thought about Owen showing up at the market in late May picking up one end of a crate without being asked. She thought about the pulley system he'd rigged in 3 hours. She thought about the notebook, the parallel records, the morning he'd said stop and made her write a list, the way he appeared at her elbow when she was spinning out, the way he'd started wrapping both hands around his cup the way Tilda did. She thought about his father, who had shown him how a waterline worked before they'd moved to town, and who was apparently not a presence in this picture anymore, and who she had never asked about directly, because she'd recognized a closed door and respected it. "How old is she?" Mira asked. 78, she's sharp. She's just tired, and she's worried about him. What's she asking for exactly? She's not asking for anything exactly, Tilda said. That's the thing. She's too proud to ask outright. But she's telling me she's worried, and when Edna Rusk tells me she's worried, that means the situation has passed the point of manageable some time ago. Mira looked out the window at the property. Owen was visible, near the south run, checking on the quarantine section, moving with the careful attention of someone who knows what he's looking for. She thought, I already know the answer to this. She had known the answer this for some time, in the way you know things that are true before you've decided whether to act on them. He had been here every day for 3 months. He knew the flock by individual bird. He knew the record system and the quarantine protocol and which nesting box the hen with the crooked toe preferred, and how much tension the rope needed on the pulley line before it went slack. He knew this farm the way you know something you've invested yourself in, and the farm she could see this plainly. Though she hadn't said it aloud to anyone, was better for him being on it. Not just the practical help, which was real, but the quality of someone who found the work genuinely interesting, who brought curiosity to it rather than just labor. That was not replaceable by finding another pair of hands. Let me talk to her, Mira said. Tilda looked at her. You don't have to decide anything right now. I'm not deciding anything right now, Mira said. I'm going to talk to his grandmother. Whatever comes from that, comes from that. Tilda picked up her cup. Something in her face settled, not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. The expression of a woman who had brought a thing to the right person and could now set it down. Steinan. Edna Rusk, Tilda said, will try very hard not to cry when you come to see her. I'll try not to let her, Mira said. She'll do it anyway, Tilda said. She's a crier. Has been her whole life. Claims she isn't. The rain continued for 4 days. Not the tentative opening rain, but the committed kind, steady and purposeful, the way November rains are in this country, falling without drama and changing everything. Creek climbed back toward its banks. The wells began recovering. The pale crust of the property softened entirely, and the ground underneath showed what it actually was. Good, dark soil, better than anyone had given it credit for, just waiting for water. Gardens that people had assumed were lost came back in small ways, not fully, not in time to save the sesame crops that were already gone, but in the green shoots that appeared at the edges of things, the persistent signs that the seeds were still there and had been waiting. The mood of Cinder Hollow shifted in those 4 days, in a way that is hard to describe precisely to anyone who hasn't experienced a drought breaking. It was not simple happiness the summer had taken things, from people that rain could not return. Corrigan family's well was still being repaired. Eli Branch had lost most of his flock and would not have laying hens again until spring. 2 families had sold livestock at terrible prices in August to cover costs, and now the prices would not come back. But something eased. Some fundamental tension that had been pulling at the settlement for months began slowly to release. Mira felt it and also didn't entirely trust it, because she had learned from this summer that ease was not the same as safety, and security was not the same as solved. She kept the record. She kept the count. She continued the daily work of the flock with the same attention she'd paid in the worst of July, because the birds didn't produce based on the season's emotional arc they produced, based on what they were given each day, consistently, and consistency didn't take breaks because the weather had improved. But she also, on the 3rd evening of rain, did something she had not done in a very long time. She sat on the porch after the day's work was done, with a cup of coffee and nothing in her hands that needed doing, and she just sat. The rain came off the roof edge in a steady curtain. Property was dark and wet and alive. She could hear it. The particular sound of soaked earth, the creek moving faster than it had in months, an owl somewhere in the east trees doing its business in the rainy dark. Most of its windows were dark. The flock was settled, and the quarantine pullets were healthy, and the sisters was half constructed and would be finished tomorrow, and the record book was up to date, and the Denver letter was written and sent. She sat and did nothing, and for approximately 20 minutes, she did not find an urgent reason to stop. She thought about the spring. She thought about standing in the market square in May, with the laughter coming at her from all directions and the weight of 46 crates of dying birds on her battered cart. She thought about the first night in the ravine, lying on her stomach in the dark, listening for the sound of animals still breathing. She thought about the first blue egg in Owen's hands, held on a piece of cloth, because he'd been careful without being asked. She thought about Vane's face in the market square when the question had hung in the air without an answer. She thought about Tilda's kitchen and the 40 minutes of instruction that had started everything that came after. She thought, I didn't do this alone. That was the thing she kept returning to in the quiet of those 20 minutes. She had done the work, the early rising, the water hauling, the blistered hands, the watching, the not quitting on all the days when quitting would have been the reasonable choice. That was hers, and she did not minimize it, because minimizing it would have been dishonest, and she had no use for dishonesty about her own labor. But Tilda had given her the knowledge. Owen had given her the pulley system and the parallel records and the habit of stopping when she was spinning. Clara Fitch had been the witness. Harlan had brought his sons and his cousins' pullets. Shaw had brought the contract and then stood beside her in the market square. Tom Garrett had provided the documentation. Decker had built the cistern right. She had not done this alone. She had started it alone, because she had to. She had sustained it alone through the weeks before anyone understood what she was actually doing. The moment it had become visible, the moment the work had produced something real enough for people to see, she had not been alone in it. She turned that over in her mind on the rainy porch. The way that isolation is sometimes necessary at the beginning of something when what you're attempting doesn't have a shape yet that others can recognize. The way that the work of becoming visible, of letting what you're doing be seen, of letting people witness it is itself a form of labor that is easy to resist when you have been laughed at enough times. She had almost resisted it too long. If Tilda had not told her plainly that the worst thing she could be was a woman alone on 5 acres, with something valuable if she had stayed quiet, kept her head down, kept hoping the problem would dark, kept hoping the problem would resolve in acquiring her to make herself more visible in a town that had given her every reason to stay small, Vane would have had what he needed. The isolation was what he'd been counting on. She had not fully understood that until she had refused to give it to him. She went to see Edna Rusk on a Friday afternoon, 4 days after the rain began. Edna Rusk's house was in town, a small place on the northern edge of the settlement with a garden that had been well tended before the drought and showed the signs of someone who had kept trying even after it was clearly going badly. There were stakes where bean vines had given up, and neat rows of turned earth that had been watered by hand longer than it was practical to continue, and a window box with 2 surviving herbs that suggested Edna Rusk was not a woman who stopped maintaining things simply because conditions became difficult. The woman who opened the door was smaller than Mira had expected. Owen had his grandmother's eyes, that same watchful attention, the quality of someone who was always assessing before committing to a response. She was thin in the way of people who have been not quite eating enough for some time, and there was a tiredness in her posture that was different from mere fatigue, the kind of tired that comes from managing something for too long without enough support. She looked at Mira for a moment, then she said, "Come in the tone of someone who has been expecting this visit and has been both dreading and hoping for it. The inside of the house was clean and organized with the precision of a person who has less energy than they used to and compensates with systems. Everything in its place. Nothing extra. The tin box on the mantel, the neatly folded blanket on the chair, the hook by the door with Owen's second hat, the one he didn't wear to the farm hanging in exactly the same place it always hung. They sat at the kitchen table because that was where conversations of weight happened, and Edna made tea because that was what you did. And they went through the ceremony of it, the pouring, the brief talk about the rain, the cautious circling, and then Mira set her cup down and said, "I'd like to talk to you about Owen." Edna's hand stilled around her cup. "He's been at my farm almost every day since June," Mira said. "I know you know that. I want you to know what he's been, what he's done there. She looked at the table for a moment, organizing what she wanted to say. He's not just been helpful. He has genuinely changed how the operation runs. The water system, the record keeping, the quarantine protocols. Those are things I could have done without him. But I would have done them worse and slower, and I would have made more mistakes. She looked up at Edna. He's bright in a specific way that doesn't always get recognized. He solves problems before they become problems. He pays attention to things that other people that I overlook. Edna Frusk was looking at the table, and her jaw was working slightly, and Mira thought Tilda was right about the crying. She waited. He talks about the farm, Edna said finally, in a voice that was careful and compressed. Every evening. He tells me what happened, what the count was, what he noticed. She paused. He told me about the egg in the cloth. First one. She stopped entirely for a moment. He said he was afraid to carry it without the cloth. He didn't want to break it. Myra said nothing. She let that sit. He's had a hard 2 years, Edna said. His father. She stopped. Started again. His father isn't in the picture anymore. Not by choice anyone made voluntarily. And Owen was very lost when we came here. He didn't talk to other children, he was just. She looked for the word. Outside the fence, Mira said quietly. Edna looked at her. Something in her eyes changed. Yes, she said. Exactly that. They were quiet for a moment. I can't offer him what a real family situation would offer, Myra said honestly. I want to be clear about that. I'm one person on 5 acres with more work than time, and I am not… She paused, choosing precision over comfort. I am not always easy to be around. I'm distracted. I'm demanding about the work. I forget to eat, and then I forget that he might also need to eat. And Owen is apparently too proud to mention it until he's been hungry for 2 hours. Edna made a sound that was almost a laugh. But he has a place there, Mira said. A real one. Not a favor, not charity. She held Ed's gaze. Part of how that farm works. That's true right now, and it will be more true as time goes on. She paused. If it would help for him to stay over some nights, or more nights, I have a room. It's not much, but it's there. Edna Rusk put both hands over her face. Mira sat quietly and let her have it, because Tilda had told her it was coming, and because it was the right thing, not embarrassing, not something that needed managing, just a person releasing something they'd been holding very carefully for a long time. After a moment, Edna took her hands down and looked at the ceiling briefly, and then back at Mira with the composure of a woman reclaiming herself by sheer will. I'm not giving him up, she said firmly. I want to be clear about that. He's mine and I'm his, and that doesn't change. I understand completely, Mira said. I'm not asking for that. But if he's there, more Edna's voice steadied. If he has a place to be and work that matters, and someone who sees what he is, she stopped. I can rest easier, she said. That's all, I can rest easier. Mira looked at this woman, 78 years old, and tired and fiercely in love with her grandson and too proud to ask for help, until the situation had made asking unavoidable, and thought, this is what most things come down to, in the end. Not the dramatic moments, the quiet negotiations, the careful love of people trying to do right by each other without quite knowing how to ask for what they need. He can come and go as you need him, Mira said. That part is yours to decide. Take whatever you can give. Edna nodded. She picked up her tea. Her hands were steadier now. He'll want to be there most of the time, she said, with the resigned affection of a woman who knows exactly who her grandson is. He'll make it sound like the farm needs him constantly. The farm does need him constantly, Mira said. That part isn't an exaggeration. Edna looked at her for a moment, and the expression on her face was layered relief and loss and gratitude all in the same place. Because that is how it feels when something hard resolves in a way that is good but still costs you something. His father showed him how water lines worked, Edna said, after a moment. It came out quietly, like something she'd been deciding whether to say. Before things went wrong. He showed him all sorts of practical things. Owen has never had anywhere to use them. She looked at the table. Until now, I suppose. Until now, Mira agreed. September arrived with the specific quality of a season that has been earned. The rains had continued intermittently through the last week of August, not the sustained weeks of rain that would fully repair the summer's damage, but enough. Enough for the creek to run properly again, enough for the wells to recover, enough for the green to come back in the places where it could. Cinder Hollow was not what it had been in May. It was leaner, more careful, permanently changed in the small ways that hard summers change a community. But it was intact. The families were fed. The stores were depleted but not empty. The livestock that had survived were recovering, slowly, on better water, and the pasture grass that was coming back in the cooler days. Vane was still in Cinder Hollow. He had not left, had not collapsed, had not undergone any dramatic public reckoning that delivered the satisfying closure of a story that resolves itself neatly. He was simply reduced. The word that Mira thought of was the right one. He had less room. The space of his influence had contracted, not because anyone had driven him out of it, but because the summer had shifted the dependencies that had maintained it. Families who had escaped their feed deaths during the crisis, months using money from odd sources, from the egg economy that Mira had created, from each other rather than from Vane's credit, had not gone back. They were not all free of him. But fewer of them were, and the ones who were had a quality of standing differently than they had before, and that changed the atmosphere of the whole. Sloane had quietly announced in late August that he would not be seeking reappointment to the assessor position. He had cited personal reasons, which everyone understood meant something more specific than personal, and no one pressed him on it publicly, because Cinder Hollow was not a town that insisted on its satisfactions being explicit. The Denver contract was renewed. Not at the same rate the hotel company had negotiated, as businesses do, and Myra had held certain terms and conceded others, and the result was a fair agreement that was slightly less lucrative per egg, but covered a larger minimum volume, which meant more reliable income against a longer horizon. Shaw had argued her corner during the negotiation in ways she hadn't asked him to, and he had shrugged it off when she mentioned it, saying he simply didn't want the supply disrupted, which was true enough, and also not the complete truth, and she appreciated that he didn't make a performance of the rest of it. The 4 pullets from Harlan's cousin integrated into the flock in late August, after the quarantine period, with the usual drama of new birds meeting, established hierarchy, some chasing, some posturing, 3 days of rearranged social order, and then settled. The smallest of the 4 turned out to be the most aggressive about establishing herself, which Owen found deeply vindicating for reasons he explained in some detail one morning while they watched it happen. The hen with the crooked toe accepted the newcomers with the equanimity of an animal that has seen enough changes to understand that the flock continues regardless. One evening in the middle of September, Mira stood at the ravine edge, Tilda on one side and Owen on the other, and they looked down at the flock moving through the last of the evening light in the shade below. 47 birds now, with the 4 pullets added, not 43, not 46, 47, a number that was both larger than she'd started with and completely different in character. These were not the same birds she'd hauled home in May. They were a flock that had survived a genuine test, that had been selected by the conditions of a brutal summer, that had proved in the most practical terms imaginable what they were made of. She thought about Harlan at the market in late May, saying, "They're not worth money, lady." And she thought about standing in her ravine now, looking at 47 birds in a hotel contract and a cistern full of water and a 10-year-old boy who had a bedroom in her farmhouse 2 nights a week and spent the rest of his time explaining things about rope tension and water pressure that she genuinely had not known before he arrived. She thought, "I had nothing figured out in May." She thought, "I still don't have everything figured out." She thought, "That turns out to be fine." The small one still asserting herself, Owen said, watching the flock. He meant the smallest of the new pullets who was in the middle of communicating her intentions to a bird, twice her size, with a confidence that was objectively disproportionate to her actual position in the order. "She'll settle," Tilda said. "Once she understands where she is." "She seems like she's already decided where she is," Owen said. "She's just telling everyone else." Mira looked at the bird in question and thought, "Yes, that's about right." Tilda went home before dark because her knees required it, and Owen went in to write the day's record, still meticulous, still parallel to Mira's, the double system that had been born from a threat and had become simply how they did things. Mira stayed at the ravine edge. The light went from gold to orange to the particular shade of deep blue that precedes full dark in late September, when the air is cool and the sky still holds a kind of warmth from the day. The flock settled below in the routine of animals, returning to their accustomed places, the soft sounds of adjustment and complaint, and then quiet. She thought about what this summer had cost her. It had cost her sleep and physical pain and worry that had kept her company in the dark hours like an uninvited guest. It had cost her certainty about the future, which she had not had much of going in, but had lost the last of during the weeks, when it wasn't clear the farm would survive September. It had cost her the comfortable smallness of a life, lived quietly below the line where powerful men noticed you. She was not below that line anymore. She did not know yet exactly what that meant for the years ahead. She thought about what it had given her. Not the obvious things, the contract, the repaired well, the cleared debts. Those were real, and she was grateful for them in the uncomplicated way of a person who has been without financial stability long enough to know its value completely. But the other things. The way Harlan Pike stood differently at her gate now, not humble exactly, but honest. The posture of a man who has given and received something real and knows the value of both. The way Clara's windows were dark, with the specific nod of a market, of a person who has chosen to stand beside you and considers the choice made. The way Tilda had said, good, that's good. When Mira had told her about the assessment revision, in the compressed tone that meant, I knew you could handle this. And Owen most of all, she had not taken 46 chickens home in May in order to find a child who needed a place to be. She had not done any of this in order to become anything in particular to anyone. She had done it because she needed to try, and she'd noticed something worth noticing, and she'd refused to stop when stopping would have been easier. Everything that had come from the work. Only from the work. There had been no other mechanism. She thought the people who laughed in May believed they already knew how the story ended. Satetsosol. They saw a large woman in the heat loading, dying birds onto a cart, and they told themselves a story about what that meant. And they were so confident in the story that they stopped looking at the actual situation. They had not been looking at the birds. They had not been looking at the legs. They had not been looking at the ravine on the northeast corner of a property they'd written off. They had been looking at Mira, at the surface of Mira, at the size, and the gender, and the aloneness, and they had decided they already knew what was there. This was the thing she kept returning to, because it was the thing that felt truest and hardest and most worth holding on to. Worth is not visible, not at a glance, not in a market square, not in the body of a person standing in front of you. It is in the structure of what they're made of, and you cannot see that structure without time and conditions, and the particular pressure of a hard season that asks every element of a thing to show what it actually is. The birds had shown it, the land had shown it, and Mira, who had never been in any doubt about her own worth, but who had spent 2 years in a town that was, and who had learned to carry that exhausting discrepancy quietly, because she had no other choice. Mira had shown it in the only way that ever actually mattered. She had done the work. She had not quit. She had noticed, and tried, and failed at some things, and kept going after the failures, and paid attention when no one else was, and accepted help when it came, and asked for it when she needed it, and given it when she could, and withheld it from no one who genuinely needed it, including the people who had laughed. That last part was the part she was least comfortable with, if she was honest. It would be a simpler, more satisfying story if she had turned Harlan Pike away at the gate, if she had let Vane's allies feel the consequences of their alignment. Most of its windows were dark. If she had rationed her generosity to the people who had treated her decently, which would have been a much smaller group, she had not done that. Not because she was a better person than she wanted to be. In her harder moments she was not. She had thought about it. She had stood at the gate on the morning. Harlan came and felt very clearly the pull of the satisfying alternative. She had imagined his face and had chosen from somewhere that was not quite principle and not quite strategy, but something in between, to give him the 6 eggs and tell him to pay when the rains came back. She had done it because the other thing, the closing off, the accounting of who deserved what cost more than she could afford. Not morally, practically. You cannot be the lifeline of a community and also the judge of which parts of the community deserve to keep living. It is simply not a job one person can hold simultaneously. She had chosen the eggs. She was glad of it. Not in a simple way. In the complicated way of someone who has made a hard choice and found, looking back at it, that it was right. In the farmhouse on the windowsill, in the late light of a September evening, sat a single pale blue egg. Owen had put it there that morning, not as a gesture, not with any ceremony, just because he'd found it when he was doing the check, and it had seemed to him like the right place for it. He'd mentioned it to Mira in passing, the way he mentioned most things, as information that was simply true. I put one on the windowsill. She'd looked at it and said nothing and gone back to what she was doing. It was still there in the evening light. Not a symbol, or not only a symbol, a real egg, perishable, from a real bird who had her own ideas about things and a crooked toe and an opinion about every other creature in the ravine. It would keep for a few days on the cool sill, and then Mira would use it, the way she used everything practically, without waste, with the particular respect of someone who understands the cost of things. But right now it sat in the window where the last of the September light caught it, and the pale blue of the shell held the light, the way it always did, not reflecting it, back sharp and bright, but absorbing it softly, the way things hold warmth when they're not trying to show it off. Mira picked up her pen. She opened the record book. She wrote the date, the count, the conditions. 41 eggs. Cool after rain. Flock stable. She wrote it in the same column, in the same hand, the same as every entry, for the past 3.5 months, because that was what the record was, not the dramatic days, not the crises, but the daily accumulation of what was true, day after day, the evidence of continuity. She finished the entry and closed the book and set the pen down. Outside, scorchback ground was quiet in the early dark. Creek ran. The rain-cooled air moved through the grass. Bitzin. In the ravine, the flock was still, and the 4 new pullets were still learning the shape of the place they'd been brought to, and the hen with the crooked toe was settled in her usual corner of the 3rd nesting box where she had spent every night since the first week in June. Mira blew out the lamp. She went to bed. In the morning there would be eggs to collect, and water to check, and records to keep, and a letter from Denver to answer, and Owen would arrive before the sun was fully up with his notebook and his hat, and whatever he'd been thinking about overnight, and had decided was relevant to the operation. There would be work. There was always work. She was not afraid of it. She had learned, over 3.5 months of doing the hardest thing she'd ever done, that the work itself was the point, not what it produced, not what it proved to anyone watching, not what it made people think of her who had once thought differently, just the daily returning to it, the choosing every morning to pick up the basket and go to the ravine and be present for what the day required. That was the only thing she'd ever controlled. The choosing. The showing up. She had shown up. The rest had followed.